I am Madeline, 29 years old, and the hidden mastermind behind one of Wall Street's most ruthless private equity firms. But to my fiancé's family, I was just a penniless accountant. At our engagement party surrounded by New York high society, my future mother-in-law slapped me twice across the face, called me a beggar, and threw my ring onto the marble floor. I simply smiled, walked out into the freezing snow, and made a single phone call. Dad, come pick me up and show them no mercy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true power until the perfect moment to strike. The sharp echoing crack of skin on skin shattered the lively atmosphere of the Astor Country Club. One moment the grand hall was filled with the sophisticated hum of 200 wealthy guests, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the soft melodies of a live string quartet. The next moment, absolute suffocating silence descended upon the room. My left cheek burned with a fierce, stinging heat, but before my brain could even fully process the physical shock of the first blow, a second slap whipped my face violently in the opposite direction. Beatrice. My 58-year-old future mother-in-law stood directly in front of me. She was a woman who wore her generational wealth like a suit of armor wrapped in custom couture and dripping with diamonds. Right now her chest was heaving, and her eyes were wild with a terrifying aristocratic rage. She grabbed my left hand with brutal force, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into my skin. With a vicious yank, she ripped the custom engagement ring right off my finger. She did not just drop it. She hurled it onto the polished marble floor with all her might. The heavy diamonds skittered across the pristine tiles, coming to a humiliating halt near the expensive Italian leather shoes of a stunned hedge fund manager. You are a beggar who does not deserve to be part of this family. Beatrice spat, her voice amplified in the dead silence of the ballroom. She made sure every single socialite, investor, and old money heir in the room heard her words clearly. Did you really think a lowly accountant could scam her way into our bloodline? We are the elite. We are legacy. You are nothing but trash looking for a meal ticket. I stood perfectly still, tasting a faint metallic tang of blood on my lower lip, where my teeth had caught the impact. The physical sting was sharp, but the irony of her words was infinitely sharper. For 3 entire years I had played my part flawlessly. I wore affordable department store dresses, drove a sensible sedan, and told everyone I managed spreadsheets for a mid-tier logistics company. I deliberately crafted this persona of a modest mid-level accountant to filter out the gold diggers, the sycophants, and the predators that circled my actual life. In my real world of private equity, people constantly wanted something from you. I dealt with hostile takeovers, leveraged buyouts, and cutthroat corporate warfare every single day. I just wanted a safe haven. I wanted to be loved for my mind and my heart, not for the billions my father and I controlled. Trevor had seemed like that perfect grounded partner. At 31, he was handsome, polished, and positioned as the vice president of his family's vast real estate empire. He had always played the role of the modern progressive heir who claimed he did not care about social class or bank accounts. But standing in the center of this opulent hall, surrounded by towering ice sculptures and imported floral arrangements, meant to celebrate our upcoming wedding, the illusion completely and violently shattered. Beatrice took a menacing step closer, her expensive floral perfume suffocating me. "I had you investigated, Madeline?" she sneered, pointing a trembling finger adorned with a massive sapphire right at my face. "You rent a tiny apartment. You have overwhelming student debt. You come from absolute nobodies. Did you really think you could infiltrate our real estate dynasty and steal our resources? My son deserves a woman of pedigree, a woman who brings capital and influence to the table, not a parasite trying to drain us dry." I kept my face entirely stoic. I did not shed a single tear, nor did I raise my voice. I simply let her scream. I let her dig her own social and financial grave in front of the entire New York upper crust. If Beatrice only knew the truth, she would be the one on the floor. I did not have student debt because I had paid for my Stanford degrees in cash. I rented a small apartment because my actual penthouse in Manhattan was undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar renovation. And as for my family being nobodies, my father, Jonathan, the chairman of a global financial conglomerate, could literally buy her entire bloodline, liquidate their assets, and still have enough left over to buy the very country club we were standing in. But Beatrice was blind to everything except her own arrogance. She gestured wildly to the crowd, playing the protective, self-righteous matriarch. "Look at her," Beatrice yelled to the silent onlookers. "Not even a single tear. She is a cold, calculating opportunist. I saw right through your pathetic little act from day one, Madeline. I knew you were just waiting to get your hands on our corporate accounts. Well, the wedding is officially off. You are expelled from this club and from our lives." The guests began to whisper. Women in silk gowns covered their mouths, shaking their heads in mock pity. Men exchanged knowing glances, clearly agreeing with Beatrice's harsh assessment. I was the outsider, the interloper who had flown too close to the sun and was now getting my wings burned off in the most spectacular public fashion imaginable. They looked at me as if I were a criminal who had just been caught red-handed. I slowly lowered my gaze to the marble floor, looking at the discarded ring, and then I looked at my purse resting on a nearby cocktail table. It was a deliberately cheap handbag, one I had bought specifically to complete my modest accountant disguise. I walked over, picked it up, and slung it over my shoulder with a terrifying calmness. The sheer tranquility of my movements seemed to unnerve a few of the guests, who unconsciously stepped back as I turned to face Beatrice one last time. I am not a victim. I am a predator who had just been handed the green light to strike. The rules of engagement had changed in an instant. Beatrice wanted to protect her family's wealth from a perceived beggar. What she did not realize was that she had just declared war on the very person holding the executioner's axe over her entire empire. I offered her a slight chilling smile, turned my back on the murmuring crowd, and began my long, deliberate walk toward the heavy oak doors of the grand hall. I paused after taking just a single step toward the heavy oak doors. The grand ballroom of the Astor Country Club was practically holding its breath, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the heating vents and the nervous shifting of expensive leather shoes on the marble floor. I turned my head slowly, letting my gaze sweep past the smirking face of my future mother-in-law and land directly on Trevor. He was standing less than 10 feet away, positioned safely behind the towering champagne fountain. This was the man who had spent the last 3 years whispering promises into my ear, swearing that we were a team, claiming that his family's old money status meant absolutely nothing to him. I looked at him, truly, looked at him, offering him one final fleeting opportunity to be the man I had believed him to be. I waited for him to step forward, to place himself between his unhinged mother and me, to demand respect for the woman he had asked to be his wife. Instead, Trevor shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He reached up with a manicured hand and adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo, deliberately avoiding my eyes. A low, mocking whisper rippled through the crowd of socialites and executives surrounding him, but he did not silence them. He absorbed their judgment and let it dictate his spine. When he finally mustered the courage to look at me, there was no warmth, no apology, and certainly no defense. His handsome face, the one I had woken up next to for years, twisted into an expression of sheer irritation. He rolled his eyes, a dramatic, juvenile gesture that spoke volumes about his true character. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, physically closing himself off from me and aligning himself completely with the woman who had just assaulted me. "Mom is right," Trevor said. His voice carried across the silent room, sharp and dismissive, lacking even a fraction of the warmth he used when trying to charm investors. "You made her mad. Just go wait outside." Those 12 words hung in the frigid air of the ballroom. They did not break my heart. They surgically removed it, freezing whatever residual affection I harbored for him into solid ice. This was not a misunderstanding. This was the ultimate cowardice-driven betrayal. He was not a partner. He was a spineless boy hiding behind his mother's designer skirt, terrified of losing his access to the family trust fund. He was willing to watch the woman he supposedly loved be publicly degraded, slapped, and humiliated simply because it was easier than standing up to Beatrice. A collective sigh of relief washed through the elite crowd. The prince had rejected the peasant. Order in their pristine, wealth-obsessed universe had been restored. Beatrice let out a short, victorious laugh, gesturing to a waiter to bring her a fresh glass of champagne, as if she had just successfully swatted away a mildly annoying insect. They all waited for the breakdown. They waited for the tears, the hysterical sobbing, the desperate pleas of a desperate woman, clinging to her last chance at upward mobility. The wives of the real estate tycoons leaned in closer, hungry for the spectacle. The hedge fund managers watched with clinical detachment, ready to see the lowly accountant crumble under the weight of her absolute rejection. But the tears never came. My cheeks still throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat from Beatrice's rings striking my skin, but my eyes remained completely dry. The moisture of grief was entirely absent, replaced by a crystalline, chilling clarity. I did not drop to my knees. I did not beg Trevor to reconsider. I did not utter a single word of defense or apology. I simply stood there, gripping the strap of my deliberately cheap purse. The soft, worn faux leather grounded me, a perfect tactile reminder of the brilliant disguise I had worn for 3 years. The disguise was now useless, shedding from my shoulders like dead weight. As the final traces of the meek, compliant accountant evaporated, the ruthless private equity executive I truly was rose to the surface. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. The subtle shift in my posture changed the entire geometry of my presence in the room. I was no longer looking up at them from a place of subservience. I was looking down on them from a vantage point they could not even begin to comprehend. I locked eyes with Trevor one last time. The irritation on his face faltered, replaced by a sudden fleeting shadow of confusion. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he registered the complete absence of despair in my gaze. He expected to see a broken woman. Instead, he was looking at an apex predator who had just been handed the green light to strike. My eerie calmness unsettled him, causing him to instinctively take a half-step backward, bumping into the edge of the champagne table. I did not break eye contact as I offered him a very slow, razor-thin smile. It was not a smile of warmth. It was a promise of absolute devastation. Without a single word, I pivoted sharply on my heel. My cheap, sensible shoes echoed against the marble with a steady, rhythmic cadence. The crowd, sensing the strange electric tension radiating from me, parted instantly. The sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos split wide open, no one daring to meet my eyes or block my path. I walked down the center of the grand hall with the measured, terrifying grace of a woman who knew exactly what she was about to do. I reached the heavy brass-handled oak doors at the front of the club. 2 uniformed staff members scrambled to pull them open for me, their faces pale and confused by the bizarre sequence of events they had just witnessed. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the suffocating warmth, the clinking crystal, and the cowardice of Trevor behind me. The freezing New York winter air hit my face the second I crossed the threshold, stinging the red mark on my cheek. But the cold felt magnificent. It was sharp, awakening, and perfectly aligned with the ice currently flooding my veins. The transition was complete. The engagement was dead, and the war had officially begun. I let the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me, sealing the fate of everyone left inside that room. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, their booming thud echoing through the crisp winter night and vibrating through the soles of my sensible scuffed heels. The sudden barrier severed the lively orchestral music and the arrogant chatter of the Astor Country Club, plunging me into the quiet isolation of the freezing driveway. The valet staff stood rigidly by their podiums, their breath pluming in the frigid air, casting uncertain glances at the woman who had just been violently and publicly exiled from New York's high society. I ignored them completely. The biting December wind whipped across my exposed shoulders, slicing effortlessly through the thin, inexpensive fabric of my off-the-rack dress. It should have been physically unbearable, a harsh addition to the searing sting still radiating across my left cheek. Instead, the plummeting temperature felt like a necessary baptism. It was rapidly freezing away the final lingering remnants of Madeline, the meek accountant, meticulously stripping off the docile, submissive facade I had maintained for 36 agonizing months. I reached into my faux leather purse, my fingers effortlessly bypassing the cheap drugstore lipstick to grip my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. There was no shaking in my hands. My heart rate was a steady, rhythmic baseline perfectly calibrated and devoid of any panic. I pulled up my favorites list and tapped the very first name. It rang only once. Madeline, the deep, gravelly voice answered. My father Jonathan never used affectionate nicknames when he was inside his study. The faint, rapid clicking of a keyboard and the muted hum of multiple television news networks in the background told me he was still at his massive mahogany desk, orchestrating global market shifts while the rest of the city slept. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the howling wind with absolute razor-sharp clarity, "come pick me up and show them no mercy." There was a microsecond of silence on the secure line. A lesser man would have panicked. A normal father would have demanded to know what happened, asked if I was hurt, or anxiously inquired if I was crying. Jonathan was not a normal father. He was the ruthless chairman of Vanguard Apex, a global financial conglomerate that possessed the capital and the sheer venom to bring entire foreign economies to their knees before breakfast. He knew his daughter better than anyone on earth. He knew that if I was officially calling the strike, the target had already dug its own grave, climbed inside, and handed me the shovel. "Where are you?" he asked. The tone instantly shifted from corporate chairman to a tactical commander launching a highly coordinated siege. There was a dangerous metallic edge to his voice, the exact pitch he used right before authorizing a hostile takeover that would leave thousands of executives jobless. "The Astor Country Club," I replied, watching a single snowflake land and melt instantly against the glass of my screen. Trevor and his mother made their final choice. They decided I was a penniless parasite trying to drain their precious legacy. They want me discarded. A low, dark chuckle vibrated through the speaker, a terrifying sound that usually preceded the total unrecoverable liquidation of a rival hedge fund. "Did they?" My father mused, the amusement in his voice dripping with lethal intent. "How profoundly unfortunate for their bloodline. I will deploy the fleet immediately. We are 10 minutes out." The line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my cheap bag, the satisfying click of the clasp signaling the official end of the family drama. The petty socialite squabbles, the agonizing debates over wedding seating charts, the suffocating Sunday dinners spent listening to Beatrice boast about her untouchable real estate empire. It was all dead and buried under the falling snow. What lay ahead was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a calculated, high-stakes financial execution. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back to let the snow fall against my skin, and began to visualize the corporate blueprint of Trevor's family. For 3 years, I had played the quiet, supportive girlfriend flawlessly. I had sat at their lavish dining tables, nodding politely, while Trevor's father boasted about his sprawling commercial properties. I had smiled demurely, widening my eyes in feigned awe when Trevor attempted to explain the fundamental complexities of leverage to me, assuming my simple accountant brain could barely grasp the concept of a variable interest rate. They had absolutely no idea that while they were patronizing me, I was mentally auditing their entire portfolio with the precision of a hawk. At Vanguard Apex, we did not build companies. We were known on Wall Street as the Undertakers. We hunted for bloated, rotting corporations, quietly purchased their debt, stripped them down to the copper wiring, and sold the bones to the highest bidder. And the Astor family's real estate empire was the most bloated, fragile, and rotting carcass I had ever laid my eyes on. Trevor genuinely believed he was a titan of industry, a master of the universe who ruled Manhattan. In reality, his family was drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. They were over-leveraged by hundreds of millions of dollars, illegally securing new loans against commercial properties that were practically condemned and falsifying their occupancy rates to appease their increasingly anxious creditors. It was a massive, precarious house of cards held together by nothing but their arrogant surname and the blind, foolish trust of their elite social circle. My mind raced seamlessly, shifting gears from a betrayed fiancé mourning a lost future into a lethal asset manager finalizing a liquidation strategy. I mentally queued up the margin calls. I visualized the brutal default notices that were already drafted, sitting safely in a highly classified encrypted file on my private work servers. I had originally acquired their debt entirely in secret, utilizing a complex web of anonymous shell companies over the past month. My initial plan, born out of a naive, lingering affection for the man I thought Trevor was, had been to restructure their massive liabilities entirely behind the scenes. I was going to save them from a humiliating, highly publicized federal bankruptcy as a silent wedding gift protecting Trevor from the fallout of his own staggering financial incompetence. Now that exact same debt was a loaded, unspared weapon resting firmly in my hands. The green light had been given. I was not just going to foreclose on their crumbling properties, I was going to dismantle Trevor's entire existence brick by brick. I was going to systematically erase his surname from the Manhattan skyline. I would seize the very country club where Beatrice was currently holding court, sipping champagne, and celebrating her perceived victory. I would freeze the offshore accounts that paid for her custom couture gowns. I would legally and ruthlessly strip them of every single asset, every luxury car, and every sprawling summer home until they were exactly what Beatrice had so viciously called me, beggars. I opened my eyes, staring out into the vast, snowy expanse of the circular driveway. The sheer scale of the upcoming destruction fueled a massive surge of adrenaline through my veins, keeping me entirely warm despite the freezing temperature. The transition within me was absolute. I felt no sorrow, no heartbreak, and no regret for the 3 years I had supposedly wasted. They were not wasted. They were an extensive, highly successful reconnaissance mission. I had gathered the critical intel, identified every structural weakness, and mapped out all their financial escape routes to ensure I could block them. There would be no escape for Trevor or his mother. The wind howled louder, whipping my hair across my stinging cheek, but I stood completely still like a sentinel in the snow, waiting for my father's cavalcade to arrive. Trevor thought he was discarding a massive liability tonight. He believed he was throwing away a weak woman who desperately needed his protection and his money. He was about to learn in the most agonizing way possible that he had just handed the keys to his kingdom directly over to a conqueror. I adjusted my posture, standing tall in the winter storm, perfectly primed for the fallout. The heavy oak doors of the Astor Country Club groaned open, spilling a harsh rectangle of golden light across the pristine snow. I did not turn around. The sharp, rapid crunch of expensive leather shoes against the icy pavement told me exactly who had followed me into the freezing parking lot. It was not a man rushing to apologize or to wrap his tailored suit jacket around his freezing fiancée. The heavy, irritated huff of breath pluming in the winter air signaled annoyance, not remorse. "Madeline, this is completely ridiculous. Stop making a scene and get back inside right now." Trevor's voice whipped through the biting wind, laced with the condescending authority of a man who believed he held every single card. I slowly turned to face him. He stood a few feet away, shivering slightly in his custom tuxedo, his arms crossed tight over his chest. His handsome features were twisted into an ugly scowl. There was no concern in his eyes for the angry red welt swelling on my cheek. There was only irritation that his perfect evening had been interrupted. Making a scene. I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotion, letting the words freeze in the space between us. "Your mother just physically assaulted me in front of 200 of your closest friends, and you think I am the one making a scene." Trevor ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, letting out a dramatic groan of pure frustration. He stepped closer, attempting to deploy the same manipulative charm he had used to gaslight me for the past 3 years. "You are blowing this entirely out of proportion, Madeline. You know how my mother gets when her blood sugar is low. She is under a lot of stress with the wedding planning. You pushed her buttons and she simply reacted. If you would just come back inside, apologize to her, and smooth things over, we can salvage this night." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his delusion wash over me. Apologize to the woman who slapped me. That was his brilliant strategy. He wanted me to crawl back into that ballroom, drop to my knees, and beg for forgiveness for the crime of letting his mother strike my face. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, a pathetic attempt to shift the blame onto the victim so he would not have to deal with the discomfort of holding his own family accountable. He wanted to rewrite history in real time, making me the villain of an attack I had just endured. "I did not push her buttons, Trevor," I said, my tone clinical and detached, analyzing him like a particularly disappointing spreadsheet. "I refused to sign my own financial death warrant." That is what made her lose her mind. The mention of the morning's events made Trevor flinch, his jaw tightening as the real root of the conflict surfaced in the freezing air. Just 10 hours prior, the day had started with what was supposed to be an intimate celebratory wedding brunch at his family's Upper East Side penthouse. There were no pastries. There was no champagne. Instead, I had been ambushed. Beatrice had slid a thick 80-page legal document across the mahogany dining table, flanked by two stone-faced corporate lawyers who looked like they were attending a funeral. It was the prenuptial agreement. "It is standard protocol for families of our stature," Trevor snapped, stepping even closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "You are being completely unreasonable about the prenup. My family has legacy assets to protect. We cannot just let an outsider walk away with half of what my grandfather built. You are acting like a gold digger, Madeline, and it is making you look desperate." I let out a short, hollow laugh that held no humor, the sound vanishing into the falling snow. "Protect your assets," I echoed, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of his defense. "Trevor? I read that entire contract while your mother sat there tapping her manicured nails, waiting for me to blindly sign on the dotted line. It did not just protect your assets. It was a vicious, one-sided trap, designed to turn me into a human shield for your corporate blunders." The terms of that document were permanently burned into my photographic memory. The stipulations Beatrice had tried to force upon me were not just greedy. They were financially predatory and blatantly malicious. If I had signed that piece of paper, I would have explicitly waived my right to any marital property alimony or spousal support in the event of a divorce. I would walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. But that was not the clause that had caused me to push the pen away and look his mother dead in the eye. It was the liability clause. Buried on page 47 in dense, convoluted legal jargon was a stipulation that required me to assume 50% of the Astor family business debts should the marriage dissolve. They wanted me to take 0% of the profits, 0% of the assets, but absorb half of their corporate liabilities. They wanted to tie my name to their sinking ship so that when the creditors finally came knocking, I would be the one thrown overboard to drown. "You expected me to sign a document that leaves me penniless while making me legally responsible for half of your company's commercial debt," I stated, my voice slicing through the wind like shattered glass. "You wanted a scapegoat, Trevor. You wanted a naive, financially illiterate accountant wife who would blindly put her signature on a ticking time bomb because she was too starstruck by your last name to read the fine print. When I refused to be your sacrificial lamb this morning, your mother realized she could not control me. That is why she attacked me tonight. She is terrified because I read the terms." Trevor threw his hands up in the air, his face flushing red with a mixture of cold and furious indignation. "You are paranoid, Madeline. You are a mid-level accountant. You look at numbers all day and see conspiracies where there are none. My family is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We do not need to trap you. We are trying to protect ourselves from opportunists. You should have just signed the damn paper and proven your loyalty to me. Instead, you embarrassed my mother. You embarrassed me and you ruined our engagement party by acting like a hysterical child." He stood there in the snow, puffing out his chest, genuinely believing he had the upper hand. He thought he was talking down to a broke, easily intimidated woman who had just fumbled her only chance at a wealthy lifestyle. He expected me to cower. He expected me to cry and beg for a second chance to prove my worth to his illustrious family. He had absolutely no idea that the woman standing in front of him had not just read the prenup. She had read his family's entire hidden financial dossier. The driveway standoff had reached its boiling point, and he had just handed me the match to light the powder keg. I looked at the man who had just called me a paranoid, hysterical child. The last remnants of my manufactured meekness dissolved into the freezing wind. I did not raise my voice, But when I spoke, the tonal shift was so drastic it made Trevor blink. Paranoid, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with clinical precision. You think I am paranoid, Trevor? Let us talk about what a simple accountant sees when she looks at the illustrious Astor family portfolio. Let us talk about the majestic Hudson Tower project your father boasts about at every single charity gala. You secured a $400 million construction loan based on a 90% projected commercial occupancy rate. But you and I both know the building is practically a ghost town. You are hovering at a disastrous 30% capacity, and you are using mezzanine financing at exorbitant predatory interest rates just to cover the monthly interest payments on the primary loan. Trevor's arrogant scowl faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting back and forth as if trying to calculate how I knew about the Hudson Tower's highly classified internal numbers. But I was just getting started. I stepped closer, my cheap, sensible heels crunching in the fresh snow, closing the distance until I could see the faint cloud of his breath. And then there is the commercial park in Lower Manhattan. I continued, my voice a relentless rhythmic strike. You leveraged that property to the absolute hilt to buy the Chicago residential portfolio, which is currently bleeding capital because of toxic environmental liabilities you failed to uncover during your supposedly rigorous due diligence. To cover the massive cash flow deficit, your family is actively shifting capital from your residential holding companies into ghost accounts in the Cayman Islands to artificially inflate your quarterly ledgers. It is textbook corporate fraud. It is an empire of toxic assets, over-leveraged properties, and cooked books wrapped in an old money bow. Your family is not worth hundreds of millions, Trevor. You are entirely underwater. You are drowning in 9 figures of bad, unrecoverable debt. And the only reason the federal regulators have not knocked on your door is because you keep shuffling the deck chairs on a sinking ship. I delivered the financial autopsy with a chilling, detached authority. The exact same ruthless authority I used when dismantling hostile corporate boards in my real life. I watched the blood drain completely from Trevor's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade in the harsh glow of the parking lot floodlights. For one glorious second, pure, unadulterated panic flashed in his eyes. He realized the docile, unassuming woman he thought he had completely controlled possessed an intimate, devastating knowledge of his family's deepest, darkest financial secrets. But his ego, cultivated over 3 decades of extreme wealth privilege and zero accountability, simply could not allow him to accept reality. The cognitive dissonance was far too great for his fragile pride to handle. Instead of recognizing the loaded gun I had just pointed directly at his chest, his mind snapped back to the only defense mechanism he knew: arrogance and gaslighting. Trevor threw his head back and let out a loud, theatrical bark of laughter. It was an ugly, forced sound that echoed off the frozen pavement. He laughed so hard he actually shook his head, running his hands down the satin lapels of his tuxedo, as if physically brushing off the sheer absurdity of my words. "Wow," he said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You really are completely insane. A bitter, crazy woman throwing a psychotic tantrum because she just watched her meal ticket evaporate into thin air." He took a heavy step toward me, his posture aggressively looming, trying to physically dominate the space between us. "You read a few outdated spreadsheets, Madeline, and suddenly you think you are a Wall Street prodigy. You memorize some financial buzzwords off the internet to try and sound smart, but you do not understand the first thing about how high-level commercial real estate operates. It is called strategic corporate debt. It is how actual billionaires do business. But I would not expect a lowly desk worker from a nobody family to comprehend the complex mechanics of generational wealth." He sneered, his eyes dropping mockingly to my inexpensive winter coat and the modest handbag clutched in my hand. His gaze was designed to make me feel small, to remind me of the massive social and financial chasm he believed existed between us. "You are just furious," he continued, his tone turning dangerously mocking and loud. "You thought you had secured the bag. You thought you were going to marry into the Astor name, move into the penthouse, and spend the rest of your life attending exclusive charity galas on my credit card. And now that my mother put you exactly in your place and saw right through your scam, you are out here screaming paranoid conspiracy theories in a parking lot like an absolute lunatic. It is pathetic, Madeline." Truly pathetic. I stared at him, letting his rapid-fire insults wash over me without a single flinch. Every cruel word he spoke only cemented my absolute lack of mercy for what was about to happen to his family. He was freely handing me the final justification to burn his fake world to ash. Trevor let out a harsh, exasperated breath, clearly exhausted by the confrontation and eager to return to the warmth and adulation of his elite peers. "I am done with this," he declared, taking a definitive, dramatic step backward. "I am done with your crazy accusations and your fake outrage. You are nothing to me now. My mother was absolutely right about you from the start. You are a parasite, and we just cut you loose." He turned his back on me, a deliberate final gesture of dismissal. He paused mid-stride, looking over his shoulder with a vicious, mocking glint in his eye. "By the way," he added, his voice ringing out crisply in the freezing night air, "I told the head of security and the valet not to assist you. Do not bother asking them to call you a cab because they work for my family, not you. You can walk back to whatever tiny, miserable apartment you came from. Find your own way home in the snow, Madeline. Have a nice life." Without waiting for a response, Trevor faced forward, straightened his spine, and strutted confidently back toward the grand double doors of the Astor Country Club. He moved with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just won the ultimate victory. He pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping back into the brilliant golden light, the warmth and the false security of his elite bubble. The doors shut firmly behind him with a heavy final thud, leaving me standing completely alone in the freezing snow-covered driveway. He thought he had left me powerless in the cold. He thought I was stranded, broken, and entirely defeated. He had absolutely no idea that I was not stranded at all. I was simply waiting for my true family to arrive. The silence of the parking lot was absolute for exactly 40 seconds. I stood alone under the amber glow of the floodlights, feeling the icy bite of the wind against my bare skin, but the cold could not touch the furnace of anticipation burning in my chest. The Astor Country Club was an isolated fortress of old money, tucked away at the end of a long, winding private road bordered by manicured evergreens. It was designed to keep the real world out, but the real world was about to crash through their gates. A low, guttural vibration began to hum beneath the soles of my shoes. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the distant rumble of a snowplow on the main highway. But the sound grew rapidly, amplifying from a distant hum into a synchronized mechanical roar that tore through the quiet winter night. The two valet attendants, previously shivering by their wooden podium, snapped to attention. They peered down the dark, tree-lined driveway, their brows furrowing in confusion. Vehicles did not approach the Astor Country Club at this speed, nor did they sound like approaching military transports. The heavy roar of the engines peaked just as a convoy of 3 massive vehicles violently rounded the final bend. They were pristine, jet-black Cadillac Escalades, heavily modified and moving in a tight, predatory formation. Their high beams sliced through the falling snow, blinding the valets and illuminating the entire circular driveway with harsh, unforgiving light. These were not the plush, leased luxury sedans of Trevor's socialite friends. They were armored, bulletproof titans with blacked-out windows and reinforced steel chassis vehicles built for extracting high-value targets from hostile territories. They did not politely slow down to approach the valet stand. The lead Escalade accelerated directly toward the grand entrance, its massive tires tearing through the thin layer of ice and snow. The driver slammed on the brakes at the absolute last second, the heavy anti-lock braking system engaging with a harsh, aggressive screech that echoed off the frosted stone columns of the club. The second and third vehicles stopped perfectly in sync behind it, completely blocking the driveway and boxing in the few idle luxury cars waiting for their owners. The synchronized snap of heavy locks unlocking echoed through the freezing air. 4 men in dark suits stepped out of the front and rear vehicles simultaneously, their eyes scanning the perimeter with clinical efficiency. But my focus was entirely on the rear door of the lead Escalade. It swung open and the atmosphere in the parking lot fundamentally altered. Jonathan stepped out into the winter storm. My father did not just exit a vehicle, he claimed the territory he stepped onto. He wore a charcoal cashmere overcoat draped immaculately over a dark bespoke suit, completely unbothered by the plummeting temperature. He ignored the valets who had instinctively taken several steps backward, completely terrified by the sudden invasion. His presence carried a gravitational weight, an aura of absolute, terrifying authority that suffocated the air around him. This was the man who dictated global market trends with a single phone call, and he had just arrived to obliterate the people who had dared to touch his daughter. His piercing steel-gray eyes locked onto me instantly. He closed the distance between us with long, measured strides. As he drew closer, his gaze catalogued my state, the thin dress, the snow accumulating in my hair, and inevitably the angry, swollen red welt blooming across my left cheek where Beatrice's heavy diamond rings had struck my skin. Jonathan stopped 2 feet away from me. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at my cheek, and I watched the temperature in his eyes drop to absolute zero. The subtle tightening of his jaw and the slight flare of his nostrils were the only physical indicators of the cataclysmic rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. He gently reached out, removing his leather glove, and lightly brushed a stray snowflake from my uninjured cheek. "You called the strike," Madeline Jonathan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no comfort, only the promise of absolute retribution. "I am ready," I replied, meeting his gaze without a flicker of hesitation. Before he could respond, the heavy passenger door of the second Escalade swung open. A sharp, rhythmic crunch of designer boots on the icy pavement announced her arrival. Nia stepped into the floodlights, bringing with her a fierce electric energy that instantly rivaled my father's imposing presence. Nia was my sister-in-law, married to my older brother, and a terrifying force of nature in her own right. A brilliant, fiercely intelligent African-American woman, she had shattered every glass ceiling in Manhattan to become the youngest, most ruthless corporate litigation attorney at Vanguard Apex. She was the legal architect of my father's most hostile takeovers, a woman who wielded corporate law like a butcher's cleaver. She looked breathtaking and lethal. She wore a tailored, plunging ivory wool coat that contrasted sharply against the dark night, a thick cashmere scarf thrown effortlessly over one shoulder. Her dark, striking features were set in an expression of pure, unadulterated hostility. Nia did not believe in empty threats. She believed in total legal annihilation, and her eyes burned with the specific thrill of a predator who had just spotted its prey. She flanked my father, her sharp gaze sweeping over me with fierce, protective, sisterly loyalty. She noted the mark on my face just as my father had, but unlike Jonathan's silent fury, Nia let out a sharp, incredulous scoff, shaking her head, as a dangerous, predatory smile stretched across her lips. "Oh, they really have no idea what they just unleashed," Nia murmured, her voice smooth like velvet, but laced with razor blades. "They actually put their hands on you, Maddie. I was going to enjoy this anyway, but now I am going to make it biblical." I smiled back at her, a genuine razor-thin smirk of anticipation. "What did you bring me?" Nia shifted her weight, unbuttoning the top of her ivory coat. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy object, holding it up into the light. It was a large burgundy leather file. In the polished, sterile halls of Vanguard Apex, we simply called it the Red Folder. The Red Folder was not a standard legal file. It was a highly classified, meticulously curated collection of financial destruction. It contained the exact instruments needed to execute the hostile takeover we had been secretly planning. Inside those heavy leather covers were the emergency injunctions, the immediate asset freeze authorizations, the commercial loan default notices, and the drafted press releases that would inform the financial world that the Astor family was officially bankrupt. It was a portable guillotine requiring nothing more than a few signatures and a federal judge's stamp, which Nia had already secured in advance. Nia held the thick burgundy folder out to me, her manicured fingers gripping the leather tightly. "Every single ghost account, every toxic asset, and every over-leveraged property they own is documented right here," she said. Her eyes locked with mine. "The trap is completely set. The creditors are on standby waiting for my signal. The moment we walk through those doors, their empire ceases to exist. We own the building they are partying in, Madeline. We own the ground they are standing on." I reached out and took the red folder from her hands. The physical weight of it was incredibly satisfying. It felt heavy with justice, packed with the cold, hard mathematics that would permanently erase Trevor's arrogant smirk and Beatrice's cruel laughter. I gripped the burgundy leather, feeling the power shift entirely into my grasp. The cavalry had not just arrived. The executioners were standing in the snow waiting for my command. The freezing New York snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, instantly catching in my hair and melting against the hot, angry welt on my cheek. The Astor Country Club was an imposing fortress of stone and glass, a monument to old money and unearned arrogance, but from out here in the freezing driveway, it just looked like a tomb. The valet attendants stood shivering by their podium, casting uncertain glances in my direction. They expected a hysterical woman, a broken fiancé sobbing into her hands after being publicly humiliated and discarded. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. There was no crying. There was absolutely no hesitation. The lingering shock of Beatrice's slap had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hyper-focused state of absolute clarity. I reached into my inexpensive faux leather purse, my fingers gliding past the cheap drugstore lipstick to retrieve my smartphone. My hands were perfectly steady. The screen illuminated the swirling snow around me, casting a pale, clinical glow across my face. I opened my contacts and selected the first name on my favorites list. The line connected almost instantly, the encrypted signal routing directly to the private study of a sprawling estate in Greenwich. Jonathan answered on the first ring. My father was not a man who required pleasantries or small talk. He was the ruthless, terrifying chairman of Vanguard Apex, a global financial conglomerate that possessed the capital and the sheer venom to completely dismantle foreign economies before his morning coffee. He operated in a world of absolute power, and he had raised his daughter to be his sharpest, deadliest instrument. "Dad?" I said, my voice cutting through the howling wind, completely steady and stripped of any residual warmth. "Come pick me up and show them no mercy." There was a fraction of a second of dead silence on the secure line. A normal father would have panicked, demanded to know what was wrong, or asked if I was injured. Jonathan simply processed the operational shift. For 3 years, I had ordered Vanguard Apex to stand down. I had explicitly protected Trevor and his family, playing the role of the quiet, unassuming accountant out of a foolish, naive desire for a normal civilian life. By uttering those exact words, I was officially lifting the blockade. I was authorizing the strike. "Where are you standing?" Jonathan asked. His tone had instantly shifted from father to tactical commander. There was a dark metallic edge to his voice, the exact pitch he used right before authorizing a hostile takeover that would leave thousands of executives scrambling for unemployment. "The Astor Country Club," I replied, watching a heavy snowflake land and melt against the glowing screen of my phone. Trevor made his final choice. He stood by and watched his mother strike me. "They believe I am a penniless parasite trying to drain their precious legacy. They want me discarded and humiliated." A low, dark chuckle vibrated through the speaker, a terrifying predatory sound that usually preceded the total, unrecoverable liquidation of a rival hedge fund. How profoundly unfortunate for their bloodline, my father mused, the amusement in his voice dripping with lethal intent. "I will deploy the fleet immediately. We are 10 minutes out. Stand your ground, Madeline." The line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my cheap bag, the satisfying click of the clasp signaling the official end of the domestic illusion. The petty socialite squabbles, the agonizing debates over wedding seating charts. The suffocating Sunday dinners spent listening to Beatrice boast about her untouchable real estate empire. It was all dead and buried under the falling snow. The narrative had permanently shifted. This was no longer a trivial family drama about a disapproving mother-in-law. This was the opening maneuver of a calculated, high-stakes corporate revenge thriller, and I was the lead architect of their impending destruction. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back to let the snow fall against my skin, and began to visualize the corporate blueprint of Trevor's family. For 36 agonizing months, I had played the quiet, supportive girlfriend flawlessly. I had sat at their lavish dining tables, nodding politely, while Trevor's father boasted about his sprawling commercial properties in Manhattan. I had smiled demurely, widening my eyes in feigned awe when Trevor attempted to explain the fundamental complexities of leverage to me, assuming my simple accountant brain could barely grasp the concept of a variable interest rate. They had absolutely no idea that while they were patronizing me, I was mentally auditing their entire portfolio with the precision of a hawk. At Vanguard Apex, we did not build companies. We were known on Wall Street as the Undertakers. We hunted for bloated, rotting corporations, quietly purchased their toxic debt, stripped them down to the copper wiring, and sold the bones to the highest bidder. And the Astor family's real estate empire was the most bloated, fragile, and rotting carcass I had ever laid my eyes on. Trevor genuinely believed he was a titan of industry, a master of the universe who ruled the New York skyline. In reality, his family was drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. They were over-leveraged by hundreds of millions of dollars, illegally securing new loans against commercial properties that were practically condemned and falsifying their occupancy rates to appease their increasingly anxious creditors. It was a massive, precarious house of cards held together by nothing but their arrogant surname and the blind, foolish trust of their elite social circle. My mind raced, seamlessly shifting gears from a betrayed fiancé mourning a lost future into a lethal asset manager finalizing a liquidation strategy. I mentally queued up the margin calls. I visualized the brutal default notices that were already drafted, sitting safely in a highly classified encrypted file on my private work servers. I had originally acquired their debt entirely in secret, utilizing a complex web of anonymous shell companies over the past month. My initial plan, born out of a lingering affection for the man I thought Trevor was, had been to restructure their massive liabilities entirely behind the scenes. I was going to save them from a humiliating, highly publicized federal bankruptcy as a silent wedding gift, protecting Trevor from the fallout of his own staggering financial incompetence. Now that exact same debt was a loaded, unspared weapon resting firmly in my hands. The green light had been given. I was not just going to foreclose on their crumbling properties. I was going to dismantle Trevor's entire existence brick by brick. I was going to systematically erase his surname from the Manhattan skyline. I would seize the very country club where Beatrice was currently holding court, sipping champagne and celebrating her perceived victory. I would freeze the offshore accounts that paid for her custom couture gowns. I would legally and ruthlessly strip them of every single asset, every luxury car, and every sprawling summer home, until they were exactly what Beatrice had so viciously called me, a beggar. I opened my eyes, staring out into the vast, snowy expanse of the circular driveway. The sheer scale of the upcoming destruction fueled a massive surge of adrenaline through my veins, keeping me entirely warm despite the freezing temperature. The transition within me was absolute. I felt no sorrow, no heartbreak, and no regret for the 3 years I had supposedly wasted. They were not wasted. They were an extensive, highly successful reconnaissance mission. I had gathered the critical intel, identified every structural weakness, and mapped out all their financial escape routes to ensure I could block them. There would be no escape for Trevor or his mother. The wind howled louder, whipping my hair across my stinging cheek, but I stood completely still like a sentinel in the snow, waiting for my father's cavalcade to arrive. Trevor thought he was discarding a massive liability tonight. He believed he was throwing away a weak woman who desperately needed his protection and his money. He was about to learn in the most agonizing way possible that he had just handed the keys to his kingdom directly over to a conqueror. I adjusted my posture, standing tall in the winter storm, perfectly primed for the fallout. I held the burgundy leather file, feeling its dense, authoritative weight ground me against the howling wind. The headlights from the 3 armored Escalades cut through the swirling snow, bathing the icy parking lot in a stark, blinding tactical brilliance. Nia stepped closer, her tailored ivory coat brushing against my frozen bare arm. She did not offer me a jacket or a sympathetic platitude. She understood perfectly that I was far beyond the need for physical comfort. Instead, she reached into the inner breast pocket of her coat and withdrew a sleek, solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. The polished heavy metal caught the harsh glare of the high beams, glinting like a drawn blade in the dead of the winter night. She held it out to me, the nib retracted, offering the exact weapon required to sever the Astor family's lifeline. I took the pen from her palm. The gold was surprisingly warm from resting against her body, a stark, grounding contrast to the plummeting temperature of the air violently swirling around us. I pivoted on my heel, turning toward the lead vehicle. The massive black hood of the SUV was slick with rapidly accumulating snow and radiated a faint mechanical heat from the powerful engine block idling steadily beneath it. I stepped up to the chrome grille, the snow crunching loudly beneath my sensible shoes, and laid the red folder flat against the polished, heated hood. The snowflakes melted instantly around the edges of the thick leather. With a sharp, practiced flick of my wrist, I twisted the cap off the Mont Blanc. I flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The crisp, thick pages of legal parchment fluttered slightly in the wind, illuminated perfectly by the dual beams of the secondary vehicle parked just a few feet behind us. There, in stark black and white, lay the absolute totality of the Astor family's arrogance, ready to be systematically dismantled. The very first document was the official irreversible debt recall. It outlined the immediate non-negotiable demand for the repayment of the $150 million toxic commercial loans they had blindly secured against their failing properties. In their original deeply flawed contracts, they had a 30-day grace period for any sudden recalls. Nia's brilliantly ruthless legal maneuvering had bypassed that clause entirely, citing gross financial negligence, falsified occupancy reports, and breach of fiduciary covenants. They now had 0 days. I pressed the golden nib against the signature line. There was absolutely no hesitation. My hand did not shake. I did not pause to consider the lavish dinners, the fake smiles, or the illusion of the future I had almost been trapped inside. I signed my true legal name with sharp, aggressive strokes. The dark ink flowed onto the page, legally binding the execution order. I flipped to the next page. Immediate margin calls on their over-leveraged, highly volatile stock portfolios. Trevor's father had foolishly used their remaining liquid assets as collateral to prop up the failing real estate side of the business. If they could not produce $60 million in hard liquid cash by the time the market bell rang on Monday morning, their entire brokerage accounts would be automatically and brutally liquidated, erasing the final traces of their corporate capital. I signed it. The pen glided effortlessly across the parchment, sealing their financial doom without a single shred of remorse. I turned to the third and final section, the asset foreclosure orders. This was the killing blow. It authorized the immediate seizure of the Hudson Tower, the commercial park in Lower Manhattan, the sprawling, ostentatious summer estate in the Hamptons, and the very Upper East Side penthouse, where Beatrice had arrogantly ambushed me just hours prior. I pressed the pen down one last time, completing my final signature with a harsh, definitive slash that tore slightly into the thick paper. The paperwork was finalized. The trap had been permanently sprung. I twisted the cap back onto the Mont Blanc with a satisfying metallic click and handed it back to Nia. She took it, a fierce, triumphant gleam dancing in her dark eyes. She carefully closed the burgundy leather folder, securing the brass clasp, and tucked it safely under her arm. Without missing a beat, she retrieved a secure, encrypted tablet from her coat pocket, quickly scanning the digital copies of the documents I had just physically authorized. Her thumbs flew across the screen, transmitting the authorization codes directly to the Vanguard Apex asset management team standing by in our global headquarters. Within seconds, the digital locks were engaging. The snow continued to fall heavily, coating the shoulders of my cheap dress in a layer of white, but the freezing air felt entirely irrelevant now. The adrenaline of the kill coursed through my veins, rendering me physically untouchable. Jonathan stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. He did not say a word, but the subtle, approving nod he gave me spoke volumes. It was the absolute validation of a mentor watching his protege execute a flawless, fatal maneuver against a hostile entity. I was no longer the docile fiancé pretending to shrink in the presence of fake old money. I was the heir to Vanguard Apex, and I had just proven exactly why our family name struck terror into the hearts of Wall Street. We turned away from the idling SUVs in perfect synchronization. The three of us formed a tight, lethal V formation, an impenetrable wall of corporate supremacy. My father took the center, radiating the cold, calculating menace of an apex predator closing in on a wounded target. Nia took his left flank, clutching the physical instrument of their ruin. I took his right, my spine perfectly straight, my chin held high, the red mark on my cheek wearing like a triumphant badge of honor. We did not run. We did not rush. We marched back toward the grand double doors of the country club with slow, deliberate, terrifying grace. The heavy snow crunched loudly beneath our synchronized footsteps, a rhythmic drumbeat announcing our return. The valet attendants scrambled backward, practically flattening themselves against the frosted stone columns, to get out of our path, completely terrified by the unmistakable aura of impending violence. We reached the top of the frozen stairs, standing directly in front of the heavy brass handles that separated the freezing reality of the night from the insulated, arrogant fantasy inside. We were a united lethal front ready to tear their entire world apart. I reached out, gripped the freezing metal handle, and prepared to pull the doors wide open. I pulled the heavy brass handles outward, and the three of us stepped across the threshold, leaving the freezing tempest behind. The immediate transition from the howling winter storm into the suffocating, perfumed heat of the Astor Country Club foyer was jarring. The air inside was thick with the scent of exotic orchids, roasted truffles, and the distinct metallic tang of old money. The ambient noise of a string quartet drifted down the marble corridors, a stark contrast to the absolute silence of the armored vehicles parked outside. We moved with relentless, synchronized purpose. My wet shoes left dark, melting footprints across the pristine Persian rugs. Jonathan and Nia flanked me perfectly, their expressions carved from granite. A pair of club concierges stationed near the cloakroom stepped forward, opening their mouths to intercept our uninvited progression, but a single lethal glance from my father froze them in their tracks. They practically flattened themselves against the silk wallpaper, their eyes wide as they recognized the sheer, unapologetic dominance radiating from the trio marching past them. We did not stop to acknowledge them. We navigated the opulent vaulted hallway until we reached the towering gold-leafed double doors of the grand ballroom. Without breaking stride, Jonathan and Nia reached out simultaneously and shoved the heavy doors wide open. The doors hit the interior walls with a resounding thunderous crack that instantly severed the ambient chatter inside the massive space. The Astor Ballroom was a masterclass in excessive, nauseating opulence. Massive baccarat crystal chandeliers hung from frescoed ceilings, casting a brilliant warm light over hundreds of New York's most elite socialites. Waiters in white tuxedos navigated a sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. At the far end of the room, dominating the space on a raised velvet dais, stood the Astor family's private tables. Right in the center of it all, holding court with a glittering crystal flute raised high in the air, was Beatrice. She was mid-toast, a condescending, triumphant smile plastered across her meticulously lifted face. And so Beatrice's refined voice rang out, carrying over the heads of her captivated audience, "We must always protect the legacy of what is ours. We elevate our inner circle, and we ruthlessly cut away the parasitic dead weight that seeks to drag us down." A chorus of polite manufactured laughter rippled through the surrounding crowd of sycophants. Trevor stood just a few feet away, sipping from a tumbler of scotch, looking entirely too pleased with himself. They were soaking up the adoration, celebrating the successful disposal of what they considered human trash. Then the laughter abruptly died. It rippled outward from the entrance like a shockwave. Heads turned, conversations evaporated mid-sentence, and the string quartet halted their playing, ending on a harsh, discordant scrape of a bow against a cello string. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto the entrance, shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to sheer, unadulterated shock. I stood framed in the grand doorway, my cheap winter coat damp with melted snow, my hair wet, and the angry red mark from Beatrice's heavy diamond rings still blazing across my cheek. I was the absolute antithesis of everything this pristine room represented. But the collective gasp from the crowd was not just for me. It was for the two imposing figures flanking my sides. Beatrice's triumphant smile shattered into a million pieces. Her crystal flute halted in mid-air. For a fleeting second, raw confusion contorted her features. She stared at me, a woman she had literally banished into the freezing night mere minutes ago, expecting me to be miles away by now, sobbing in the back of a cheap taxi. Instead, I had returned, and I had brought an invading force. Her gaze darted to Nia, taking in the razor-sharp ivory coat, the burgundy leather folder clutched like a weapon, and the terrifying predatory intelligence radiating from her dark eyes. Then Beatrice looked at Jonathan. My father stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, surveying the glittering ballroom with the detached clinical disgust of a man inspecting a rat infestation. The sheer executive authority pouring off him was a suffocating weight that pressed down on the entire room. But Beatrice's legendary arrogance was a terminal disease. It blinded her to the very real danger standing right in front of her. The confusion on her face rapidly morphed into a mask of ugly, visceral outrage. She could not comprehend that the power dynamic had completely inverted. To her, I was still just the beggar, the insignificant, penniless outsider who had dared to infect her bloodline. And by returning, I had committed the ultimate unforgivable sin. I had embarrassed her in front of her peers. She slammed her champagne flute down onto the linen tablecloth so hard the fragile stem nearly snapped. The sharp clinking sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent ballroom. "How dare you, Beatrice!" hissed her voice, vibrating with a shrill, venomous fury that amplified across the massive space. She stepped off the dais, pointing a manicured, shaking finger directly at my face. "You insolent, pathetic little beggar! I told you exactly what would happen if you ever showed your face near my family again." Trevor, standing behind his mother, finally snapped out of his bewildered trance. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson, a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious indignation. He took a heavy step forward, his fists clenching at his sides, completely appalled that his discarded liability had dared to return to the scene of her humiliation. "You must be entirely out of your mind, Madeline." Trevor barked, his voice carrying aggressively over the silent crowd. "I told you it was over. I told you to get lost. You are publicly humiliating yourself. Get out of here before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Beatrice. Beside me, Jonathan remained perfectly still, a silent, looming executioner, waiting for the drop of the blade. Naya simply tilted her head, a cold, mocking smile playing at the corners of her lips, her manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the burgundy leather of the red folder. Beatrice, refusing to tolerate my silent defiance for another second, raised her hand high into the air and snapped her fingers with a sharp, abrasive crack. She turned her furious gaze toward a massive, broad-shouldered man standing near the edge of the dais, his security earpiece coiled neatly behind his neck. Davies. Beatrice shrieked entirely, losing her refined, high-society composure. Her face contorted with unhinged rage. "Get this trash out of my sight immediately. I want her physically thrown out onto the street. If she resists, drag her out by her hair. Do not let go of her until she is bleeding in the gutter." The head of security, a hulking man built like a concrete pillar, immediately stepped forward. He gave a sharp nod and signaled to 3 other suited guards stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. They began to converge on the entrance, their expressions set in grim, professional determination, moving swiftly to execute the matriarch's violent command. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The elite guests, the titans of industry, the socialites, and the heirs to vast fortunes stood completely paralyzed. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of anticipation. They clutched their pearls and their drinks, watching with wide, morbidly fascinated eyes as the Astor family's private security detail closed in, fully expecting to watch the lowly, discarded outsider get brutally dragged away into the winter storm. Davies lunged forward, his massive frame eating up the distance between the velvet dais and the grand entrance in mere seconds. The 3 security guards followed tightly in his wake, forming a tactical wedge designed to isolate and physically extract a threat with maximum efficiency. I could see the polished silver of the earpiece coiled around his thick, muscular neck and the straining seams of his dark suit jacket across his broad shoulders. He was a seasoned professional, a man paid exceptionally well to maintain the pristine, undisturbed bubble of the Astor Country Club and to swiftly remove any unpleasant realities that dared to breach its walls. Beatrice stood on the tips of her toes on the raised platform, practically vibrating with vicious anticipation. She wanted violence. She wanted to see me physically broken, humiliated, and dragged across the polished marble floor like common refuse, while her elite peers watched in amusement. But as Davies closed the final 10 feet, the brilliant cascading light from the baccarat chandeliers fully illuminated the three of us standing motionless in the doorway. He did not look at me first. His eyes instinctively locked onto the towering, immaculate figure standing perfectly still to my left. Recognition struck the massive security chief like a physical blow to the chest. It was instant, visceral, and absolute. The aggressive forward momentum of his charge vanished, replaced by a sudden jarring halt. His heavy rubber-soled shoes skidded sharply on the polished marble floor as he desperately arrested his own momentum. The three guards behind him, unprepared for the sudden stop, collided with his broad back, their aggressive formation instantly collapsing into a confused, frantic cluster. Davies stared directly at Jonathan. He stared at the chairman of Vanguard Apex, a man whose private security detail rivaled federal detachments and whose face was a staple in global financial intelligence briefings. Then his gaze shifted slowly, terrifyingly to me. I watched the cognitive gears grind and lock into place behind his panicked eyes. He connected the dots. He realized that the quiet, unassuming accountant, the Astor family, had been freely mocking for 3 years, was standing shoulder to shoulder with the most ruthless financial predator on the eastern seaboard. Davies did not just stop his advance. He took a deliberate, highly visible step backward. He lowered his head, snapping his chin down toward his chest in a posture of total, undeniable submission. The three guards, taking their immediate cue from their terrified commander, mirrored the gesture, stepping aside and bowing their heads respectfully. They cleared a wide, unobstructed path, completely refusing to raise their eyes to meet ours. Beatrice let out a shrill, undignified squawk that echoed awkwardly over the silent crowd. Davies, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her mounting hysteria. "What are you doing? I gave you a direct order. Seize that pathetic girl and throw her out immediately. Do your job, you incompetent fool." Davies did not move a single muscle. He remained entirely frozen, his eyes glued to the expensive Persian rug beneath his feet. That was when Nia moved. The sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels echoed through the deathly silent ballroom as she stepped forward, effortlessly, bridging the gap between our united front and the cowering security detail. A razor-sharp, utterly mocking smile stretched across her lips, illuminating her striking features with a dangerous, predatory delight. She did not raise her voice, but she projected it perfectly, ensuring her crisp syllables carried to the furthest, darkest corners of the opulent room. "I would strongly advise against reprimanding Mr. Davies." Beatrice Nia said, her tone dripping with venomous condescension and legal authority. "He is simply exercising basic self-preservation. Unlike you, he possesses the cognitive capacity to recognize when a battle is already catastrophically lost." Nia unclasped the heavy brass lock of the burgundy leather folder she held tucked securely under her arm. With a theatrical, devastatingly smooth motion, she flipped the heavy cover open and withdrew a thick stack of legal parchment bearing a heavy embossed gold seal. She held the document up high, displaying it to the entire room of silent, captivated socialites. "Let me clarify the current operational hierarchy for you, Beatrice." Nia continued, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a fatal, inescapable sentence. "What I am holding is the master deed to the Astor Country Club, along with the adjoining championship golf course, the private marina, and the surrounding 200 acres of prime real estate. You see, this illustrious institution has been hemorrhaging capital for the better part of a decade. The operating costs were drowning the board of directors, and they were desperately seeking a lifeline. 30 days ago, Vanguard Apex executed a quiet, highly aggressive, hostile takeover. We bought the entire commercial mortgage, paid off the primary creditors in cold cash, and acquired 95% of the voting shares. Nia lowered the document slowly, her dark, piercing eyes locking onto Beatrice's horrified face. "We are not trespassing, Beatrice. Madeline's firm owns this building. She owns the chairs your esteemed guests are currently sitting on. She owns the crystal flute trembling in your hand. She is the undisputed majority owner of this entire establishment. You just stood on a stage in front of New York's most elite circles and loudly ordered your security staff to physically assault their ultimate employer." The impact of Nia's words was cataclysmic. The absolute unvarnished truth struck the velvet dais with the force of a wrecking ball. I watched the blood rapidly and completely drain from Beatrice's face, leaving her meticulously maintained complexion a sickly translucent shade of gray. The deep dark tan she had acquired during her lavish vacations seemed to vanish, replaced by the pallor of a corpse. Her mouth hung open, her lips trembling slightly as she desperately tried to form a coherent response, but absolutely no sound emerged. The sheer suffocating weight of pure public humiliation crushed the breath right out of her lungs. Trevor stumbled backward, his shoulder colliding heavily with the edge of a linen-draped catering table. The tumbler of scotch slipped from his numb, unresponsive fingers, crashing onto the marble floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass made several nearby guests flinch violently, but no one looked away from the spectacle on the dais. They were entirely captivated by the total annihilation of the Astor family myth. The room full of sycophants, the very people Beatrice had spent decades manipulating and courting, began to physically pull away. I could see the subtle shifting of designer gowns and tailored suits as the crowd instinctively took a synchronized step back from the raised platform, eager to immediately distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Beatrice's colossal error. The rigid social order of the room had violently realigned in a matter of seconds, and Beatrice was left standing completely exposed, powerless, and utterly ruined in the center of her own stolen castle. The heavy, unbroken silence that followed the shattering of Trevor's glass was the perfect acoustic canvas for Nia's next move. She stepped past me, her posture radiating the clinical, detached authority of a surgeon preparing to make a fatal, necessary incision. She did not seek the spotlight, she simply consumed it. Taking the absolute center stage of the ballroom, she positioned herself directly beneath the largest crystal chandelier, ensuring every single guest had an unobstructed view of the impending execution. The string quartet remained frozen in the shadows, bows hovering above strings as the entire assembly of New York's upper crust held their breath. From the dark edge of the velvet dais, the patriarch of the family finally emerged. Trevor's father pushed past his catatonic wife and his trembling son, his face a mask of desperate forced diplomacy, slick with a sudden sheen of cold sweat. He adjusted his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket, attempting to summon the commanding presence that had allegedly built his family's reputation over the decades. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, plastering on a hollow, politician's smile designed to soothe the nervous investors watching his every move. He opened his mouth, likely to suggest they move this unfortunate misunderstanding to a private boardroom away from the prying eyes of their peers and the circling sharks of high society. Nia did not even grant him the dignity of a complete sentence. She raised her hand, a single sharp motion that cut through the air and silenced him instantly. She was no longer just the woman holding the deed to the building. She had seamlessly transitioned into her official capacity as the lead litigator and chief legal counsel for Vanguard Apex. When she spoke, her voice lacked any trace of the emotional hysteria Beatrice had displayed just moments prior. It was calm, measured, and devastatingly precise, carrying the lethal weight of an irrefutable legal mandate. Mr. Astor, Nia began her words echoing clearly off the frescoed ceilings. Do not attempt to mitigate this. There will be no private negotiations, no backroom deals, and no temporary extensions. I am acting as the duly appointed representative of your primary creditor. You are currently in gross violation of 7 distinct fiduciary covenants. You have willfully defaulted on your primary commercial obligations, and your secondary assets are entirely irreversibly overleveraged. Trevor's father stopped dead in his tracks. The fake smile evaporated from his face, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that he was entirely outmatched. He glanced nervously at the surrounding crowd, his eyes locking with several of his key business partners and major corporate investors. They were already looking at him differently. The polite deference was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating scrutiny of predators realizing a former ally was now bleeding out in the water. With ruthless efficiency, Naya reached into the burgundy leather folder and extracted a thick, densely packed stack of legal documents. They were bound by heavy brass clips, the physical manifestation of the trap I had authorized out in the freezing snow. She took 2 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between them, and thrust the massive stack of papers directly against the center of his chest. He had no choice but to bring his hands up to catch them, instinctively clutching his own financial death warrant against his tuxedo shirt. "You have been formally served," Nia announced, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "Those documents contain the immediate foreclosure orders on the Hudson Tower Commercial Park and your primary corporate headquarters in Lower Manhattan. As of this exact moment, Vanguard Apex has frozen all associated operating accounts. Your access to the company's liquid capital is permanently revoked, and your board of directors has already been notified of your immediate removal." Trevor, still standing beside his mother, let out a choked, breathless sound. He lunged forward, grabbing his father's arm, his eyes frantically scanning the top page of the dossier. He could read the bold, uncompromising legal headers, but his privileged brain seemed entirely incapable of processing the reality of the words. Nia did not give him time to catch up. She reached into her folder a second time and pulled out a separate, thinner envelope. She handed it directly to Trevor, slapping it against his palm with a sharp, dismissive strike that echoed through the quiet room. "And for you, Trevor," Nia stated, her eyes locking onto his terrified face. "Those are the immediate margin calls on your heavily volatile stock portfolios. Your brokerage accounts have been flagged for severe delinquency. If you cannot produce $60 million in liquid capital by the opening bell on Monday morning, the bank will automatically liquidate your entire position. Every single asset you hold as collateral will be stripped and sold at market value to cover the deficit." The air in the ballroom seemed to grow substantially colder as the sheer scale of the devastation settled over the crowd. The whispers began to rise, a low, buzzing hive of panicked conversation. Wealthy peers, lifelong friends, and trusted board members were already doing the mental arithmetic, calculating their own financial exposure to the rapidly sinking Astor ship. Men in expensive suits discreetly pulled out their cell phones, firing off urgent messages to their own wealth managers, PR representatives, and legal teams. The social hierarchy of the room was actively rewriting itself, and the Astors were plummeting straight to the absolute bottom without a parachute. Nia stood her ground, a majestic statue of corporate supremacy, letting the brutal reality of the situation saturate the opulent room. She looked at Trevor, then at his father, and finally cast a fleeting, dismissive glance at Beatrice, who had sunk into a velvet chair, clutching her chest as if she might faint. The financial guillotine had fallen with flawless clinical precision. The blade had severed their lifelines completely, leaving no room for appeal, no margin for error, and absolutely nowhere left to hide. They had lived their entire lives believing their wealth made them invincible, untouchable deities ruling over a city of peasants. Now they were standing in the center of a crowded ballroom, holding the literal paperwork of their absolute ruin, surrounded by peers who were already turning their backs. They were entirely bankrupt, both financially and socially. The fortress they had built out of deceit, arrogance, and leveraged debt had completely collapsed, leaving them exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. Nia turned her back on them, an act of supreme, undeniable dismissal, and walked back to her position beside me. She had delivered the fatal blow, executing her duty with a terrifying grace that left the entire room paralyzed in awe and absolute terror. Nia paused just before reaching my side. The whispers in the room were growing a frantic, chaotic hum of speculation. She knew that in the world of high society, ambiguity was the ultimate enemy. If left to their own devices, the Astors would immediately attempt to spin a tale of a temporary liquidity crisis or a minor contractual dispute. The execution required total, unvarnished transparency. Nia pivoted slowly, turning her sharp gaze back upon the sea of elite guests. She raised her chin, and when she spoke again, her voice was amplified by the sheer commanding force of her projection, ensuring every single titan of industry in that room heard the unmitigated truth. For those of you whispering about a simple misunderstanding, let me dispel that illusion immediately. Nia announced, her words dropping like heavy anvils onto the polished marble floor. You are not witnessing a minor corporate restructuring. You are looking at a family that has just defaulted on $150 million in commercial loans. They have zero liquid assets. They have zero credit. They are by every legal and financial metric completely and utterly insolvent. The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible, a sharp hiss that sucked the oxygen from the massive ballroom. But Nia was far from finished. She stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger toward the trembling figures on the dais. Do not let your sympathies be swayed, she warned the crowd, her tone shifting from clinical to sharply accusatory. This is not the result of a shifting market or bad luck. This is the result of systematic, calculated fraud. The collateral they used to secure those loans was entirely fabricated. We have uncovered years of falsified occupancy reports across their entire commercial portfolio. They artificially inflated property appraisals, invented ghost tenants to simulate revenue, and routinely breached the most fundamental fiduciary covenants binding their enterprise. The word fraud hung in the air, toxic and paralyzing. In the cutthroat world of Manhattan, real estate bankruptcy was a sin, but fraud was an absolute contagion. And it gets worse. Nia continued, delivering the final fatal blow. Vanguard Apex is legally obligated to report these findings. The fraudulent loan applications have already been forwarded to the appropriate regulatory bodies. By Monday morning, the Astor family will be facing comprehensive federal audits. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the White Collar Division of the FBI are currently preparing their subpoenas. Anyone whose capital is tied to their holding companies will be dragged directly into a federal investigation. That was the breaking point. The velvet rope of polite society completely snapped. In the center of the crowd stood a tight cluster of VIP guests, the highly sought-after venture capitalists and private equity managers who had been sharing drinks with Trevor just an hour ago. Trevor had been relentlessly courting them all evening, pitching a massive, supposedly lucrative new waterfront development project. He had sold them on the illusion of his family's indestructible wealth, leveraging the Astor name to secure hundreds of millions in initial commitments. Now, the horrific realization dawned on these seasoned investors. They were not being invited to join a legacy project. They were being targeted to unknowingly bail out a sinking Ponzi scheme. The physical reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The VIP guests backed away in disgust, literally putting distance between themselves and the dais, as if the Astors were radiating a deadly virus. Expressions of polite interest mutated into masks of pure, unfiltered revulsion. These were men and women who protected their capital with ruthless paranoia, and they had just missed stepping onto a financial landmine by mere inches. Suddenly, the ballroom was illuminated by the harsh bluish glow of hundreds of smartphone screens. It happened all at once, a frantic, synchronized movement, as the city's most powerful players whipped out their devices. Thumbs flew across digital keyboards with desperate speed. They were mass emailing their wealth managers, texting their legal teams, and calling their offshore brokers. The hushed, frantic whispers filling the room were a chorus of financial self-preservation. I could hear the panicked, clipped orders echoing over the string quartet's abandoned instruments. Pull the term sheets, cancel the wire transfers, sever all contact, liquidate our shared positions immediately. The capital that had fueled the Astor family's arrogance for generations was evaporating into the digital ether in real time. Trevor saw it happening. He watched the glowing screens and heard the frantic commands, recognizing the exact moment his entire future was incinerated. Panic, blind, and animalistic took over his features. He scrambled off the velvet dais, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the spilled scotch, and lunged toward a silver-haired billionaire standing near the front of the crowd. "Arthur, please!" Trevor begged, his voice cracking with absolute desperation as he reached out a trembling hand. "You know me. You know my family. This is just a hostile tactic. We can explain everything. The waterfront project is still fully viable. We just need to finalize your funding by tomorrow. The billionaire recoiled violently, slapping Trevor's hand away as if he had been touched by a leper. "Do not speak to me." Arthur spat, his voice laced with absolute venom. "You tried to use my money to cover your fraudulent debts. If you or anyone from your disgraced family ever contacts my firm again, I will personally ensure you are locked in a federal penitentiary." Arthur turned his back on Trevor, immediately signaling his private security detail to clear a path toward the exit. The rejection was highly contagious. As Trevor spun around, frantically trying to lock eyes with anyone who might throw him a lifeline, he met a solid wall of turned backs and averted gazes. No one would look at him. No one would acknowledge his existence. The entire social ecosystem of New York's elite had collectively decided to amputate the Astor family from their ranks. They were marooned on an island of absolute isolation. Beatrice sat slumped in her chair, her hands covering her face as she wept, her manicured nails digging into her own skin as the reality of her social excommunication set in. Her husband stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the foreclosure documents in his hands, completely broken by the public broadcast of his criminal negligence. They had spent their entire lives cultivating an aura of superiority, using their wealth to bully, manipulate, and discard anyone they deemed beneath them. Now the very people they had considered their peers were treating them like toxic waste. I watched them unravel from my position beside my father. There was no pity in my heart, no lingering trace of the docile, accommodating girl they had abused. I stood tall, the red mark on my cheek serving as a testament to their brutality, while they drowned in the shallow, unforgiving waters of their own deceit. The public dismantling was absolute. We had not just taken their money, we had systematically eradicated their legacy, their freedom and their name, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the impending nightmare of federal prosecution. The suffocating quiet that had blanketed the ballroom was violently shattered by a sharp, piercing electronic trill. It was the distinct high-priority ringtone of the patriarch's private encrypted smartphone. The sound cut through the heavy air like a physical strike. Trevor's father flinched as if the noise had burned him. His hands, still clutching the dense stack of foreclosure documents, shook uncontrollably as he fumbled to reach inside his tailored tuxedo jacket. He yanked the device out, nearly dropping the polished metal rectangle onto the marble floor. The bright glare of the screen illuminated his ashen, terrified face. He swiped to answer, pressing the phone frantically against his ear. The voice on the other end was loud enough, frantic enough, that the harsh, panicked syllables bled out into the surrounding silence. It was his senior executive account manager from Manhattan's most exclusive private wealth bank. "What do you mean, frozen?" Trevor's father barked, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp that stripped away every ounce of his cultivated aristocratic refinement. "Override the lock right now. I am your largest client. You authorize the operational transfers immediately, or I will have your job by morning." The response from the tiny speaker was a rapid, terrified staccato of apologies and terrifying legal realities. I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain from the older man's face. He staggered backward, his spine hitting one of the massive fluted columns supporting the ballroom archway. He let the phone slip from his ear, his arm dropping limply to his side. The executive manager's voice was still pleading through the speaker, repeating the same devastating phrase. The corporate accounts were completely locked. Every single credit line, every revolving debt facility, every emergency reserve fund had been instantly and permanently frozen by the compliance division. They had zero access to their operational capital. The Astor empire had just flatlined. Hearing his father's catastrophic failure, Trevor descended into sheer, unadulterated panic. He ripped his own phone from his pocket. The screen was already flooded with a cascading waterfall of urgent push notifications. Fraud alerts, margin call warnings, and automated account suspension emails stacked on top of one another in rapid, terrifying succession. His breathing turned ragged and shallow. He held the phone up to his face, but his features were so contorted by pure terror that the biometric facial recognition software failed to unlock the device. Swearing viciously under his breath, his thumbs clumsily hammered out his manual passcode. He tapped the sleek black icon of his primary wealth management application. This was the digital vault where he kept the liquid millions he used to fund his lavish, reckless lifestyle. The loading circle spun for an agonizing 3 seconds. Then the interface snapped open. There was no polite greeting. There was no portfolio summary. Instead, a glaring solid red banner dominated the top of the screen. Account suspended. Pending federal investigation. Trevor stared at the digits displayed beneath the warning. Where there had once been an 8-figure cushion of generational wealth, there was now only a stark, unforgiving 0. He tapped the screen furiously, his fingernails clacking against the tempered glass. He navigated to his offshore holdings, his supposedly untraceable accounts in the Caymans, and his volatile cryptocurrency wallets. Nia's asset tracking algorithms had been utterly flawless. Every single digital vault he opened displayed the exact same horrifying result. 0, 0, 0. His entire net worth had been wiped from existence with a few keystrokes. Trevor dropped his phone. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, the screen fracturing into a spiderweb of broken glass mirroring the complete destruction of his reality. He grabbed his own hair, letting out a raw, guttural sound of pure despair. The sheer panic and terror infecting the men finally radiated outward, striking Beatrice with the force of a physical blow. She had remained slumped in her velvet chair, paralyzed by the social excommunication unfolding around her. But as her husband leaned against the stone column, gasping for air, and her son clawed at his own head in the ruins of his digital wealth, the abstract concept of bankruptcy suddenly crystallized into a brutal physical reality. Beatrice's eyes darted frantically down to her own trembling hands. She stared at the massive 10-carat flawless diamond ring glittering on her finger. She looked down at the custom hand-stitched Parisian silk gown draped elegantly across her thin frame. Her breathing hitched, transforming into a rapid, audible hyperventilation. She looked toward the grand entrance of the club, her mind undoubtedly racing toward the safety of her chauffeur-driven, armored Bentley parked outside in the freezing snow. She desperately wanted to flee to retreat to her sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse on the Upper East Side and lock the heavy mahogany doors against this waking nightmare. Nia, tracking Beatrice's panicked gaze with the predatory precision of a hawk, took one deliberate step forward. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was laced with a chilling absolute authority that pinned Beatrice directly to her velvet chair. "Do not even consider attempting to leave the premises in that vehicle." Beatrice, Nia commanded, her dark eyes locking onto the trembling matriarch. "The repossession agents dispatched by Vanguard Apex have already secured the perimeter. Your Bentley, along with the 2 Escalades accompanying it, have been booted, tagged, and legally seized. The keys currently sitting in your driver's pocket are now the exclusive property of our Asset Liquidation Division." Beatrice let out a high, reedy gasp, clutching her hands against her chest as if trying to hold her shattering heart together. "And before you think about retreating to your penthouse," Nia continued, twisting the metaphorical blade with clinical perfection, "I strongly suggest you check your email. The electronic key fobs to your private elevator and your front doors were remotely deactivated 10 minutes ago. Your residence is currently being secured by a private security firm acting on behalf of the bank. Every piece of art, every piece of jewelry, and every stick of imported furniture inside that apartment is now collateral. In fact, given that you purchased the very haute couture gown you are wearing on a heavily leveraged corporate credit card that is currently in default, even the clothes on your back belong to us." The ultimate realization of her new impoverished reality slammed into Beatrice. She was no longer a queen. She did not own a home. She did not own a car. She did not even own the fabric draped across her shoulders. The designer gowns, the luxury vehicles, the sprawling real estate portfolio had all evaporated in the blink of an eye, legally transferred to the very woman she had just ordered to be thrown into the gutter. Beatrice let out a long, horrifying wail, a sound completely devoid of her usual refined elegance. It was the ugly, primal scream of a woman whose entire identity had just been incinerated. She curled inward, wrapping her arms around her stomach, sobbing uncontrollably in front of the silent, unblinking crowd of New York's elite. They watched her unravel, offering absolutely no comfort, no sympathy, and no assistance. The Astor family had been completely severed from their power-stripped bare and left to drown in the absolute terrifying zero of their bank accounts. Trevor's breathing slowed as the finality of his financial obliteration penetrated his thick skull. He stared at his broken phone, then at his mother, a pathetic weeping heap of ruined silk, and finally at his father, a hollowed-out shell of a man, leaning weakly against a marble column. The golden, impenetrable shield of the Astor name had entirely melted away, leaving nothing but exposed, bleeding flesh. He turned his frantic gaze to the crowd, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face among his former sycophants and eager investors. He found absolutely none. He met only cold, calculating stares and expressions of open disgust. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His social capital was dead. His family could not save him. His wealth was a phantom. His survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of manipulative social climbing, aggressively kicked into overdrive. The Astor ship was resting at the bottom of the ocean, and it was time to abandon the crew. Trevor slowly raised his head, his panicked eyes locking onto mine. The transformation was instantaneous and deeply grotesque. The sneering, entitled arrogance that had dominated his features all evening completely vanished, replaced by a mask of manufactured, desperate anguish. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. He completely bypassed his paralyzed father and physically stepped around his mother's sobbing form, treating the woman who had birthed him like discarded debris. Madeline Trevor choked out, his voice cracking with a perfectly calibrated sob that echoed through the deathly silent ballroom. "Madeline, please listen to me. You have to listen to me." He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at the cowering figure of his mother. It was her. It was all her doing. Beatrice's head snapped up. Her tear-streaked, ruined face contorted in sheer, unadulterated horror as her golden child, the beloved son she had gleefully destroyed me to protect, aimed the executioner's blade squarely at her throat. "She forced me to do it," Trevor yelled, stepping further away from the velvet dais, violently severing himself from his own bloodline. "She told me that if I did not publicly get rid of you tonight, my father would instantly cut me out of the family trust. She threatened to destroy me, Maddie. She poisoned my mind for months, constantly whispering that you were just a gold digger, that you would drag our pristine family name through the mud. I did not want to humiliate you. I swear to God, I never wanted to hurt you. She orchestrated this entire nightmare. She planned the speech, she handed me the microphone, and she forced me to pull the trigger." Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless gasp, reaching a shaking hand out toward her son, but Trevor refused to even look in her direction. The crowd let out a collective, disgusted murmur. Even in a room filled with ruthless, cutthroat corporate sharks, the sight of a grown man tossing his own mother to the wolves to save his own skin was a bridge too far. But Trevor was entirely deaf to their judgment. He had absolute tunnel vision, and I was his only remaining exit strategy. He closed the final few yards between us. Then the former heir to the Astor Empire collapsed. His expensive tuxedo pants hit the polished marble floor with a heavy, humiliating thud. He fell to his knees directly at my feet, bowing his head in total, absolute subjugation. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with heavy, glistening tears. It was a masterful performance, utilizing the exact same boyish charm that had originally captivated me 3 years ago. "I was a coward," he wept, reaching out to grasp the hem of my dress. He stopped inches short when Jonathan took a single menacing half-step forward, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over Trevor's kneeling form. Trevor swallowed hard, retracting his hand but keeping his tearful gaze locked on my face. I was terrified of losing the family money, but sitting here watching it all burn to the ground, I realize none of it matters. The cars, the penthouses, the status, it is all completely meaningless without you. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, pleading with the frantic fervor of a condemned man begging for a pardon. "I love you, Madeline. I always have." Underneath the immense pressure and the toxic expectations of this family, my heart never stopped belonging to you. He shifted closer on his knees, letting the tears spill freely over his cheeks, entirely abandoning any shred of masculine pride. He was banking everything on the quiet, unassuming accountant he thought he knew, desperately hoping my inherent kindness would override my intellect. I was weak, but I am free of them now, he pleaded, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. We can start over. Just you and me, exactly like we always talked about when we were alone. I do not care about the bankrupt accounts or the foreclosed properties. Look at the man I am when I am with you. You make me better. He took a ragged, theatrical breath, delivering his ultimate desperate pitch. Please, I am begging you, for the sake of the 3 years we shared, for the nights we spent dreaming about our future, for everything we built together, call off your lawyers, tell Vanguard Apex to stand down, give us a chance to fix this. Please, Maddie, save me from them. Save us. The silence that followed his plea was absolute. Trevor knelt on the floor, weeping and trembling, a pathetic portrait of a man who had sacrificed his pride, his dignity, and his own mother on the altar of his cowardice. He waited, utterly breathless, believing his performance was flawless enough to rewind the clock and undo his catastrophic failure. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling at my feet, feeling absolutely nothing. The manufactured tears streaming down his perfectly bronzed face, the desperate tremor in his voice, the theatrical clasping of his hands, it was all a breathtakingly hollow performance. Trevor had spent his entire life assuming that everyone around him was a gullible mark, a stepping stone to be used and discarded at his convenience. He truly believed that a few desperate apologies and a declaration of undying love could instantly overwrite the reality of his actions. Slowly, without breaking eye contact with his terrified, upturned face, I reached into my sleek evening clutch. I did not yell. I did not display a single ounce of the emotional devastation he clearly expected to see. Instead, I withdrew a thick, heavy black envelope sealed with a discreet wax stamp. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, letting the ambient light from the baccarat chandeliers catch its matte surface. Your performance is genuinely spectacular, Trevor, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the dead silence of the ballroom with surgical precision. But you always possessed one fatal, inescapable flaw. You consistently underestimate the people you consider beneath you. With a simple flick of my wrist, I tossed the heavy envelope downward. It hit the polished marble floor precisely between his knees. The impact cracked the wax seal, and a dozen high-resolution 8x10 photographs spilled outward, sliding across the stone like a deck of tarot cards, dealing a final, inescapable doom. Trevor's gaze instinctively dropped. The moment his eyes registered the images scattered across the floor, his manufactured tears instantly evaporated. The flush of adrenaline and performance art vanished from his cheeks, leaving his face a stark, chalky white. The pure, unadulterated panic that replaced his fake sorrow was the first genuine emotion he had displayed all evening. Staring back at him from the glossy prints were undeniable time-stamped chronicles of his ongoing 6-month affair. There he was captured through a telephoto lens, entering the private rear entrance of the St. Regis Hotel with his supposedly estranged ex-girlfriend Victoria. There they were sipping expensive vintage champagne on a secluded balcony in St. Bart's during the exact week he claimed he was suffering through grueling back-to-back real estate negotiations in London. There was a beautifully crisp, magnified image of a receipt for a $500,000 diamond tennis bracelet purchased under a dummy corporation being fastened around Victoria's wrist. You see, I continued, my heels clicking sharply against the marble as I took a slow, deliberate step around his kneeling form. An accountant's true strength does not lie simply in balancing a ledger. It lies in noticing the anomalies, the quiet, subtle discrepancies, the tiny leaks in the cash flow that suggest a secondary hidden set of books. Numbers tell a story, Trevor. And your story was written in sloppy offshore shell companies and careless, untraceable wire transfers. A collective disgusted gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers. The wealthy investors and venture capitalists still standing in the room leaned forward, their eyes widening as they recognized the staggering implications of the photographs. Trevor had not just been defrauding their corporate funds to keep his family's sinking empire afloat. He had been actively siphoning that stolen capital to fund a lavish secret double life with his mistress. Trevor scrambled frantically, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the glossy paper. He tried to gather the photographs, pulling them against his chest, as if hiding them now could somehow erase the fact that hundreds of the city's most powerful people had already seen them. "Do not try to hide them," I instructed coldly. "The board of directors and the federal auditors will be receiving their own complete copies by morning. But let us clarify your actual motive, Trevor. You did not stay with me for 3 years because you harbored some secret repressed love. You stayed because I provided the ultimate perfect cover." He froze, clutching the photos, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I stood tall, the oppressive shadow of Jonathan and Nia flanking me, transforming my words into an inescapable verdict. "You needed a quiet, self-sufficient woman who asked no questions and demanded no spotlight," I explained to the captivated, horrifyingly silent room. "You wanted a docile, financially independent partner who would manage your mundane expenses and keep up the pristine public appearances. Your mother's relentless hostility was not a tragic obstacle for our relationship. It was a highly convenient smokescreen. While I was wasting my energy trying to earn her impossible approval, you were busy moving your remaining liquid assets into offshore trusts registered under Victoria's name." Trevor lowered his head, pressing his forehead almost to the floor, his shoulders heaving as the absolute truth systematically dismantled his last remaining defense. "Your blueprint was entirely parasitic," I stated, my voice echoing with ringing finality. "Your master plan was to eventually discard me with nothing, marry your mistress, and use my steady, unassuming income to subsidize your basic living expenses while you hid your remaining wealth from the impending corporate audits. You thought you could string me along as a blind, obedient ledger keeper to finance your deceit, while the Astor Empire crumbled around you." I stopped pacing and planted my feet directly in front of him. He was a ruined, pathetic shell of the arrogant heir who had walked into the club tonight. He had tried to play a rigged game of chess with a woman who secretly owned the entire board. I looked down at his trembling form, studying him with the clinical, unfeeling detachment of a scientist observing a failed, insignificant experiment. "You chose the wrong girl to manipulate." The finality of my words acted as a starting pistol for the paralyzed crowd. The lingering, morbid curiosity of the VIPs completely vanished instantly, replaced by an overpowering, ruthless instinct for social and financial survival. No one wanted to be caught standing anywhere near the epicenter of the Astor family's catastrophic detonation. The exodus was sudden, highly synchronized, and brutally silent. There were no polite farewells, no air kisses, and absolutely no sympathetic pats on the shoulder for the fallen elite. The venture capitalists, the real estate moguls, and the society matriarchs turned as a single panicked organism and marched aggressively toward the grand mahogany double doors. The soft, chaotic rustle of expensive silk gowns and the sharp, rapid clatter of polished dress shoes filled the massive space, creating a frantic percussion of total abandonment. Guests abandoned half-empty crystal champagne flutes on passing catering trays and left untouched caviar canapes on the linen-draped tables. I watched as men and women practically shoved each other out of the way to reach the coat check first, desperate to reclaim their cashmere overcoats and flee the premises. Outside the towering, arched windows of the country club, the chaotic flashing of red tail lights illuminated the falling snow. A massive fleet of black town cars and luxury sedans was already peeling out of the circular driveway, their tires spinning wildly on the icy cobblestones. They were fleeing the toxic fallout of the Astor collapse like citizens evacuating a radioactive quarantine zone. Within 3 minutes, the grand ballroom of the Astor Country Club was entirely hollowed out. The string quartet had hastily packed their instruments and vanished through the service corridors, eager to escape a client who could no longer pay their invoice. The catering staff, realizing the night was over, had quietly slipped away into the shadows of the kitchens. The Astor family was completely alone. the vast cavernous room designed specifically to host hundreds of adoring, wealthy sycophants now only served to magnify the absolute terrifying isolation of the three broken figures remaining on the floor. The silence that rushed in to fill the sudden void was heavy, oppressive, and suffocating. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the ringing, deafening silence of total annihilation. The only sounds remaining in the massive space were the distant faint hum of the heating vents and the ragged, uneven breathing of the ruined family. Trevor remained frozen on his knees, his hands resting limply on his thighs. His eyes were fixed vacantly on the scattered glossy photographs of his own treachery, but he made absolutely no move to gather them. His mother Beatrice was still curled tightly in her velvet chair, her tear-streaked face buried deep in her trembling hands. Her shoulders heaved with silent, violent sobs as she rocked back and forth, entirely consumed by the evaporation of her social empire. But it was the patriarch of the family who finally broke the terrible static tableau. Trevor's father staggered away from the fluted marble column that had been keeping him upright. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, and deeply alarming. The graceful, commanding stride of a billionaire titan was completely gone, replaced by the stumbling, desperate gait of a broken man. He reached a heavy velvet armchair near the edge of the dais and practically collapsed into it. His weight hit the cushions with a heavy, defeated slump, sending a small cloud of dust into the pristine air. He brought a violently trembling hand up to his chest, clutching the lapel of his tailored tuxedo jacket directly over his heart. His breathing was rapid and shallow, a desperate wheezing sound that echoed sharply against the frescoed ceilings. He pulled at his silk bow tie with frantic, uncoordinated fingers, tearing it loose as if the expensive fabric were suddenly strangling him. The healthy, artificially tanned color had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray under the brilliant glare of the baccarat chandeliers. His eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the crystal, the gold leaf accents, and the towering imported floral arrangements. He was looking at his kingdom, but he was no longer seeing his property. He was looking at Vanguard Apex's newly acquired assets. I watched him process the sheer insurmountable magnitude of their destitution. The cognitive dissonance was visibly tearing him apart. For 60 years, the Astor name had been an unbreakable shield of generational wealth, a golden ticket that granted them unquestioned access to the highest echelons of global power. They had operated with total impunity, destroying smaller competitors, manipulating financial markets, and crushing everyday people beneath the wheels of their luxury cars. Now, every single element of that fabricated reality had been systematically dismantled and incinerated. The sprawling historic mansions in the Hamptons and the Aspen ski lodges were gone, legally seized to satisfy their massive commercial defaults. The fleet of armored Escalades, the private jet shares, and the yachts docked in Monaco had all been instantly repossessed by the banks they had spent years defrauding. Their pristine, unblemished legacy was currently being ripped to shreds by federal auditors and aggressive investigative journalists. The false pride that had insulated them from the consequences of their own arrogance had been utterly shattered, leaving them completely exposed to the brutal, freezing wind of consequence. Trevor's father let out a long, ragged groan, a sound of profound, inescapable defeat. He leaned his head back against the velvet chair and stared blankly up at the painted ceiling, his hands dropping limply over the armrests. The crushing reality settled over the room, pressing down on the three of them with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. They were no longer titans of industry. They were no longer untouchable elites commanding the respect of the city. They were entirely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and facing the immediate prospect of federal criminal prosecution. The empire was dead, and its former rulers were left sitting in the luxurious ruins, entirely consumed by the quiet, echoing finality of their own absolute destruction. The crushing silence in the ballroom was finally broken, not by Trevor, nor by his paralyzed father, but by a sharp, ragged intake of breath from the velvet armchair. Beatrice Astor, a woman whose entire existence had been defined by ruthless intimidation and the strict enforcement of social hierarchy, was unraveling at an astonishing speed. The perfectly tailored Parisian silk gown now hung awkwardly on her shaking frame. The icy, unblinking composure she had weaponized for decades cracked, shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. Her hands weighed down by flawless diamonds that now legally belonged to a corporate liquidation division trembled so violently that the heavy jewels clicked against each other. Just 1 hour ago, this exact woman had stood tall and imperious, her manicured hand striking my cheek with the force of absolute, unquestioned authority. She had looked down her nose at me as if I were a diseased rodent, a grotesque inconvenience staining her pristine family portrait. She had ordered my total destruction with the casual ease of ordering a cocktail. Now completely stripped of her endless credit limits, her sprawling real estate portfolio, and the terrifying weight of the Astor name, the illusion of her superiority vanished. There was no regal matriarch left. There was only a terrified aging woman staring into the horrifying abyss of absolute poverty. Beatrice tried to stand. She gripped the velvet armrests, her knuckles turning bone white, and forced herself upright. But the sheer psychological shock of her new impoverished reality had physically drained her. Her legs clad in designer heels simply refused to support her. Her knees visibly buckled. She staggered forward, her arms flailing wildly for balance, completely abandoning any remaining shred of aristocratic dignity. She did not catch herself. Beatrice collapsed onto the hard, polished marble floor. The impact was heavy bruising and entirely undignified. She landed just inches from where her son was already kneeling, creating a twisted, pathetic mirror image of total submission. She crawled forward on her bare hands and knees. The delicate fabric of her custom gown dragged across the stone, collecting the dust of her ruined empire. She stopped directly at the tips of my shoes. She tilted her head up, and the sight was almost difficult to process. The immaculate, terrifying socialite was entirely gone. Tears poured down her face in thick, continuous streams. The heavy, waterproof mascara and expensive eyeliner she wore had completely surrendered, running down her cheeks in dark, muddy rivers that stained her pale skin and dripped onto her diamond necklace. Her perfectly coiffed hair clung damply to her sweating forehead. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving with ugly, hysterical sobs that she made absolutely no effort to suppress. She reached out her trembling fingers, hovering just millimeters from the fabric of my dress, clearly afraid that Jonathan would physically intervene if she actually made contact. She clasped her hands together in a pose of desperate, fervent prayer. "Madeline," she gasped, her voice unrecognizable. It was a high, reedy squeak entirely devoid of its usual booming theatrical resonance. "Madeline, please, you have to listen to me." She was hyperventilating, struggling to force the words past the sheer panic constricting her throat. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly, foolishly wrong." She leaned closer, the smell of her expensive perfume mixing with the sharp, acidic scent of pure, unadulterated fear. "You are not what I said. You are brilliant. You are a sweet, brilliant girl, and you have always been the best thing that ever happened to my son. You are exactly the kind of sweet, brilliant daughter-in-law I always prayed Trevor would find." The absolute audacity of her pivot was breathtaking. The woman who had literally ordered my social execution, who had plotted to ruin my professional reputation and toss me into the freezing street, was now eagerly rewriting history while kneeling in a puddle of her own tears. She was attempting to weaponize affection, utilizing the exact same manipulative tactics her son had attempted just moments prior. It was a pathetic, transparent display of self-preservation. She was perfectly willing to rewrite her entire reality, her entire set of core beliefs, if it meant keeping her penthouse keys. I was blinded by stress. Beatrice wept, her chest heaving violently. The banks, the creditors, the relentless pressure to maintain our position. It drove me insane, Madeline. It made me do terrible, unforgivable things to protect my family. But you understand business. You understand pressure. You are a genius. She practically spat the compliments out, firing them like desperately aimed arrows, hoping one would hit a soft spot in my armor. You are the smartest woman in this room. You outmaneuvered all of us. You proved your worth 100 times over. We were blind not to see it. She pressed her hands to her chest, her sobbing growing louder, echoing harshly against the frescoed ceilings of the empty ballroom. "Please, Madeline, I am a mother begging for her family. We have learned our lesson. You have completely humbled us. You have won. There is no need to destroy us completely. Give us a second chance. Let me welcome you into this family properly. We can be partners. We can be a true family. Just tell your liquidation team to stop. Call off the asset seizures. I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize. I will kiss your feet. I will transfer whatever titles you demand. Just please, I am begging you, do not leave us with nothing." Beatrice bent forward, pressing her tear-stained face directly against the cold marble, right at the toes of my heels, weeping uncontrollably. Her hysterical cries filled the massive space, a harsh, pathetic soundtrack to the death of a dynasty. The untouchable queen of New York society had surrendered every ounce of her pride, offering herself up as a willing, groveling servant to the woman she had once viewed as a peasant. She lay there shaking and sobbing into the stone, desperately waiting for a pardon that was never going to come. I stood perfectly still as Beatrice's tears pooled against the tips of my shoes. The damp, shivering weight of her despair radiated upward, yet it failed to penetrate the absolute glacial calm that had settled over my mind. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman. There was a time not so long ago when the mere sight of Beatrice Astor displeased would have sent me into a spiral of anxious appeasement. I would have folded myself into whatever shape she demanded, just to secure a fraction of a polite smile, terrified of losing the man I mistakenly thought loved me. Now, watching her literally grovel in the dust of her incinerated reputation, I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, not even a lingering spark of anger. She was simply a stranger suffering the inevitable mathematical consequences of her own supreme arrogance. The cavernous ballroom, stripped of its sycophantic audience, amplified the raw, ugly sounds of her hysteria. Trevor remained frozen beside her, a pathetic, whimpering accessory to her collapse. His father had not moved from the velvet armchair, staring blankly at the frescoed ceiling, as if waiting for a divine intervention that would never arrive. They were a tableau of total moral and financial bankruptcy, trapped in a gilded cage that had suddenly transformed into a prison of their own design. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch. I let them marinate in the absolute finality of their ruin. I wanted the reality of their powerlessness to permanently etch itself into their memories, a lingering scar to remind them of the exact moment they lost everything. Slowly, with deliberate, unhurried grace, I shifted my weight. I did not step back from Beatrice's grasping hands, nor did I kick her away. Instead, I crouched down, the silk of my dress pooling around me on the polished stone, bringing my face level with her ruined, tear-streaked visage. She gasped her breath, catching in her throat as she looked up at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, sudden flare of hope. She genuinely believed her pathetic display had worked. She thought she had found a crack in my armor, a residual drop of the compliant, desperate-to-please girl she had tormented for 3 relentless years. I did not raise my voice. I did not sneer, and I did not shout. I simply did not need to. True power never requires volume. It requires absolute, unshakable conviction, exhibiting absolute, unbreakable control. I leaned in closer, forcing her to look directly into the cold, unyielding reality of her destruction. The scent of her panic was sharp and bitter, a stark contrast to the cloying, expensive perfume she usually weaponized. The silence in the room stretched so tight, it felt as though the very air might shatter. "My family has no room for beggars who do not deserve to be here," I whispered. The syllables fell from my lips with crystalline perfection. I mirrored her exact cruel words from earlier in the evening, returning the venomous blade she had driven into my chest with lethal precision. The phrase struck her with the force of a physical blow. The manufactured hope instantly drained from her widened eyes, replaced by a hollow, bottomless despair. Her jaw went slack, and a fresh, agonizing wail tore from her throat. She collapsed fully against the marble, her entire body shuddering as the realization washed over her. There would be no mercy. There would be no salvation. The Astor legacy was officially dead, executed by the very woman they had deemed unworthy to stand in their presence. Trevor let out a guttural sob, burying his face in his hands, finally understanding that his parasitic survival strategy had been permanently severed. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own making, entirely devoid of the safety net he had spent months trying to exploit. Without another glance, I straightened up. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, adjusting my posture until I stood taller than I ever had during my entire 3-year nightmare with this family. I did not look at Trevor's shaking shoulders. I did not spare a fraction of a second for his father's catatonic stare. They were ghosts of a past I was permanently leaving behind. I turned my back on the wreckage. Jonathan was waiting right behind me, his towering frame a silent, impenetrable fortress. His expression was a mask of professional stoicism, but as our eyes met, a brief, profound glint of respect flickered in his dark gaze. David stood to his left, casually adjusting his expensive cuffs, the sharp, calculating attorney wholly satisfied with the absolute legal devastation he had helped orchestrate. Nia flanked my right, her tablet already tucked away securely, her posture radiating the clinical predatory efficiency of an apex predator who had successfully hunted and consumed her prey. They had executed my orders flawlessly, dismantling a titan of New York society without breaking a sweat. Together, we moved toward the grand mahogany exit. Our footsteps synchronized a steady, rhythmic march that echoed sharply against the stone floor, completely drowning out the pathetic, weeping chorus of the fallen dynasty. We walked down the sweeping, carpeted staircase, moving past the abandoned coat checks and the deserted reception desks. The luxurious veneer of the country club now felt like a cheap, hollow movie set, entirely stripped of its intimidating aura. The walls that had once represented an impenetrable fortress of old money elite now just looked like crumbling plaster. The heavy brass doors swung open, pushed by unseen staff who had miraculously reappeared to facilitate our departure. The crisp, freezing air of the New York winter hit my face, shocking my system with its pure, bracing clarity. The suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the Astor Empire was instantly washed away in the icy breeze. I stepped out onto the snow-dusted pavement, leaving Trevor and Beatrice sobbing alone in the ruins of their fake empire. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the cold night air, finally and completely free, ready to step into a future that belonged entirely to me. 1 month later. The biting, chaotic winter wind of that night at the country club had long since yielded to the crisp, sterile climate control of my Manhattan penthouse office. I stood perfectly still before the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, looking out over the sprawling metallic grid of the city below. Down on the streets, millions of people moved like microscopic currents in a vast mechanical ocean, completely oblivious to the tectonic shifts of wealth and power that had recently transpired. Up here, 50 stories above the relentless symphony of traffic, there was only a profound, insulated silence. My office was a testament to unapologetic minimalism and absolute control. Sleek surfaces of polished obsidian and brushed steel replaced the suffocating antique mahogany and inherited dusty clutter of the Astor aesthetic. There were no fake oil portraits, no fabricated legacy items, and absolutely no sycophants. There was just the razor-sharp reality of an empire built on pure, unadulterated merit. The soft, barely audible click of the heavy glass door opening broke my quiet reverie. Nia strode into the room, her presence as sharp and uncompromising as the skyline behind me. She did not bother with pleasantries or gentle introductions. Our dynamic had always operated on the currency of pure, ruthless efficiency. She carried a sleek, encrypted tablet, her eyes already scanning the scrolling data columns before she even reached the edge of my desk. She dropped into the Barcelona chair opposite me, her posture rigidly professional, fully prepared to deliver the final autopsy report on a dynasty we had systematically eradicated. The final liquidation protocols cleared the federal regulatory hurdles this morning at precisely 9 o'clock. Nia began, her voice a rapid staccato rhythm of absolute finality. Every major asset has been officially transferred, liquidated, or absorbed into Vanguard Apex Holdings. It is a completely clean, hermetically sealed legal execution. There is zero exposure, zero corporate liability, and absolutely no avenue for a judicial appeal. She tapped the screen, projecting a sprawling, complex financial web onto the smart glass surface of my desk. It was a digital graveyard. Trevor's family firm no longer exists as a coherent corporate entity. We did not just bankrupt them. We entirely dismantled their infrastructure, severed their supply chains, and sold the company off for parts. I watched the data cascade across the glass, tracing the ruthless mathematical anatomy of their destruction. The commercial real estate division, once the glittering crown jewel of Trevor's father's fraudulent empire, had been carved up and auctioned to aggressive offshore developers who had instantly gutted the properties for redevelopment. Their flagship commercial leases were legally voided, the prime Manhattan storefronts immediately reassigned to our own subsidiary brands. The intellectual property, the proprietary software they had brazenly stolen from smaller tech startups, was legally seized, repackaged, and sold at a premium to their fiercest overseas competitors. Even the office furniture, the ergonomic executive chairs, the imported Italian conference tables, and the ridiculous modern art installations had been auctioned off to discount liquidators. The entire corporate structure had been unraveled with surgical precision, leaving absolutely nothing but a hollow, decaying shell of bad debts, voided contracts, and toxic liabilities. And the personal assets? I asked, my tone perfectly matching Nia's clinical detachment. Nia swiped to a new screen, bringing up a series of bleak, undeniable public records. The eviction from the sprawling Hamptons estate was finalized 3 weeks ago. The banks did not even bother granting them a standard 30-day grace period. The Monaco yacht, the Aspen ski lodge, and the private aviation shares were repossessed by international creditors immediately following the country club incident to satisfy their catastrophic margin calls. She paused, a rare, fleeting ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth as she pulled up a grainy street view image. They are currently residing in a cramped 2-bedroom walk-up apartment in deep Queens. The building has outstanding municipal code violations for faulty plumbing and chronic pest control issues. The lease is month-to-month, secured only because a distant, estranged cousin reluctantly agreed to act as a financial guarantor. The mental image was stark, unyielding, and profoundly satisfying. Beatrice Astor, a woman who once threw a glass of vintage champagne at a caterer for serving it at slightly the wrong temperature, was now forced to navigate the grim realities of peeling linoleum floors, clanking unreliable radiators, and shared basement laundry facilities. Trevor, who had built his entire fragile identity around bespoke tailored suits, exclusive VIP access, and inherited superiority, was now trapped in a decaying claustrophobic box. He was permanently stripped of the unearned wealth that had previously masked his utter incompetence and profound cowardice. But the shocking loss of luxury was merely the surface layer of their punishment. The true horror of their new reality lay in the relentless, suffocating legal avalanche that was currently crushing them into the pavement. The civil lawsuits are multiplying exponentially. Nia continued, pulling up a terrifying, endlessly scrolling list of active court dockets. Every vendor they defrauded, every independent contractor they stiffed, and every former employee they illegally terminated has filed a formal grievance. The sheer volume of litigation is mathematically impossible for them to fight, let alone settle. They cannot afford competent legal representation, which means they are being forced to navigate a hostile, unforgiving judicial system entirely unequipped and completely exposed. And the federal level, I prompted, knowing the final lethal mechanism we had set in motion. Nia's eyes gleamed with cold, predatory satisfaction. The IRS audits have officially transitioned from standard inquiries to full-scale multi-agency criminal investigations. The offshore tax havens they used to conceal their embezzled funds were fully exposed during our initial acquisition audits and immediately flagged for federal review. Government agents have already seized Beatrice's remaining personal bank accounts, frozen Trevor's hidden offshore trusts, and placed liens on any potential future earnings. They are quite literally drowning in federal subpoenas, facing immediate tax fraud charges, and staring down the barrel of severe, unavoidable prison sentences. I turned back to the window, absorbing the sheer total permanence of the situation. This was not a temporary setback for the Astor family. This was not a minor public scandal they could quietly sweep under the rug or outrun by fleeing to a European villa. This was absolute, undeniable annihilation. We had surgically removed them from the ecosystem of power, permanently burning the bridge back to the life they had so viciously stolen from others. The fake empire had been reduced to ash, and the unrelenting winds of consequence had scattered the remains. The consequences were permanent, irreversible, and entirely deserved. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm, bitter liquid ground me in the present moment. The ledger was finally balanced. I turned away from the sprawling city lights, the chill of the glass fading from my skin as I left the penthouse office. Stepping out of the private elevator later that evening, the sterile clinical precision of my corporate sanctuary dissolved into the rich, inviting warmth of my personal dining room. This was not a space designed for intimidation, asset liquidation, or cold calculation. It was a haven built entirely for trust, laughter, and authentic connection. A long, custom-carved dining table of reclaimed walnut sat at the center of the spacious room, bathed in the soft golden glow of ambient pendant lighting. The air was thick with the savory, intoxicating aromas of roasted garlic truffle reduction and a perfectly aged Bordeaux that had just been uncorked by a private chef working quietly in the adjacent kitchen. Seated around the table were the only people in the world who truly mattered. Jonathan was laughing, a deep, resonant, and joyous sound that entirely contradicted the intimidating, monolithic enforcer persona he wore during business hours. He was pouring another generous glass of wine for David, who had finally loosened his signature silk tie, rolled up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt, and discarded his tailored suit jacket over the back of a chair. The brilliant attorney, usually armed with lethal injunctions and ruthless contractual loopholes, was currently locked in a passionate, highly entertaining, and entirely light-hearted debate with Nia over the culinary merits of traditional French cooking versus modern, experimental fusion cuisine. Nia, completely stripped of her encrypted tablets, wireless earpieces, and terrifyingly efficient data streams, looked radiant and deeply relaxed. She wore a simple, elegant cashmere sweater, her sharp, analytical wit now directed at playfully teasing David's conservative wine preferences rather than dismantling corporate hierarchies. I took my seat at the head of the table, not as a commanding CEO delivering orders, but as a sister sitting among equals. We did not share a single drop of blood, but we shared something significantly stronger, something that could never be inherited or bought. We shared absolute, unyielding loyalty forged in the fires of high-stakes battles. Watching them exchange plates, share stories, and burst into spontaneous laughter, I recognized the profound, undeniable difference between a genuine family and a parasitic syndicate. The Astors had demanded total submission, insisting that I shrink myself, mute my intelligence, and beg for scraps of approval just to fit into their incredibly fragile manufactured egos. The people sitting with me tonight had only ever asked me to lead. They supported my vision, challenged my blind spots, and protected my flanks without a single ounce of resentment or jealousy. As the evening progressed and the lavish dinner transitioned to artisan desserts and rich espresso, the laughter settled into a comfortable, contented hum. Leaning back in my chair, I allowed myself a long overdue moment of quiet reflection. I thought back to the very beginning of my relationship with Trevor, examining the naive, overly cautious woman I had been. I had actively chosen to hide my empire, masquerading as an unremarkable, financially average designer scraping by in a tiny studio apartment. I had convinced myself that minimizing my worth was the ultimate foolproof litmus test for true love. I believed rather foolishly that by concealing my wealth and burying my influence, I could successfully filter out the gold diggers, the opportunists, and the sycophants to uncover genuine, unconditional affection. But looking at the smoldering wreckage of the past 3 years, The harsh, unforgiving reality became glaringly obvious. Hiding my success had not protected me from predators in the slightest. In fact, it had done the exact opposite. It had merely attracted a completely different, far more dangerous breed of parasite. By actively diminishing my light, I had drawn in a man who thrived exclusively on my perceived vulnerability. I had invited a family that savored the opportunity to exploit, belittle, and control a perceived subordinate. By shrinking myself to be easily digestible to appear non-threatening and manageable, I had inadvertently offered myself up as a captive feast for extreme narcissists. They did not love the fake struggling Madeline. They simply loved the power they held over her. I realized now with absolute unwavering certainty that true protection did not come from playing small, hiding in the shadows of my own achievements, or dulling my edges to make other people feel more comfortable. The ultimate shield was not deception or strategic humility. The ultimate impenetrable shield was the establishment of ironclad boundaries and the unapologetic fierce demand for basic respect. If my corporate power intimidated a man, he was simply the wrong man. If my undeniable success threatened a family's fragile artificial hierarchy, they were fundamentally not a family worth joining. I had spent years desperately trying to pass a brutal, degrading test that was entirely rigged against me from the start, when I should have been the one setting the standards, holding the pen, and grading the exam. I reached out and raised my crystal glass, the faceted edges catching the warm, amber light of the dining room. Jonathan, David, and Nia immediately paused their conversation, turning to me with matching expressions of deep, unwavering respect. I offered a silent internal toast to the brutal, necessary lesson I had learned, and a spoken toast to the brilliant, formidable team that had stood by my side through the darkest storms. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, ringing sound echoing beautifully through the warm room, sealing a bond that no amount of external pressure, societal expectation, or toxic manipulation could ever break. My journey had begun in the suffocating, freezing shadow of a counterfeit dynasty, trapped in a web of deceit and misplaced loyalty. But it was ending here, bathed in the light of an empire I had built and defended with my own bare hands, surrounded by the family I had actively chosen. I took a sip of the rich wine, savoring the taste of absolute victory. I turned away from the table, looking directly forward, the clarity of the moment washing over me with a brilliant, empowering heat. Sometimes the loudest revenge is absolute, silent, legal destruction. Have you ever had a family member try to crush your worth only to find out they messed with the wrong woman? Tell me your story in the comments below, and remember, never apologize for your power. Madeline illuminates a profound truth: shrinking ourselves to fit into a remarkably fragile world never guarantees truly authentic love. When we hide our brilliance or mask our success to test others, we do not filter out the opportunists. Instead, we attract toxic predators who thrive on perceived vulnerability. True security is not found in playing small or performing humility. Rather, it is forged by establishing ironclad boundaries, demanding absolute respect, and unapologetically embracing our own power. Own your brilliant empire fully. Have you ever dimmed your inner light to comfort other people? And how did you stop? Please comment below.